Section 33 of the Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. Section 33. George William Curtis, 1824 to 1892, by Edward Cary. George William Curtis was born in Providence, Rhode Island, February 24, 1824, of a New England family, his ancestry on the father's side running back in unbroken line to the Massachusetts settlers of the first half of the 17th century. Though his home was in New York from early boyhood, he was through life a type, one of the best, of New England manhood. The firm, elastic, sometimes hard fiber of a steadfast and intense moral sense was always found, occasion requiring, beneath the social grace and charm and the blithe and vivid fancy of the author. His schooling was brief, a few years only before the age of 11. The rest of his education, which was varied and in some lines thorough, was gained by reading, with private tutors, with his accomplished and gifted stepmother, and, richest of all, alone. In 1842, while yet a lad of 18, he went for a couple of years as a boarder to Brook Farm. There, to quote his own words, were the ripest scholars, men and women of the most aesthetic culture and accomplishment, young farmers, seamstresses, mechanics, preachers, the industrious, the lazy, the conceited, the sentimental. But they associated in such a spirit and under such conditions that, with some extravagance, the best of everybody appeared. Compared with other efforts upon which time and money and industry are lavished, measured by Colorado and Nevada speculations, by California gold washings, by oil boring and the stock exchange, Brook Farm was certainly a very reasonable and practical enterprise, worthy of the hope and aid of generous men and women. The friendships that were formed there were enduring. The devotion to noble endeavor, the sympathy with what is most useful to men, the kind patience and constant charity that were fostered there, have been no more lost than the grain dropped upon the field. These 2 years, and one spent on a farm at Concord, Massachusetts, near the homes of Emerson, Hawthorne, Thoreau, were followed by 4 years in Europe, in Germany, Italy, France, Egypt. And in 1851, at the age of 27, Curtis took up seriously the work of a writer. Within a year he published 2 small volumes, The Nile Notes of a Hawaji and The Hawaji in Syria. For a couple of years he was a writer on the New York Tribune, where his Brook Farm friends, Ripley and Dana, were engaged, and Lotus Eating was made up of letters to that paper from the then famous watering places. He dropped newspaper work to become an editor and writer with Putnam's Magazine, and the Potiphar Papers and Prue and I were written for that periodical. For a time he formed a connection with the printer of Putnam's in a publishing business, in which, and through the fault of others, he failed, assuming, quite beyond the requirements of the law, debts which it took a score of years to discharge. Finally he found his publishing home with the house of Harper & Brothers. At first a contributor to the magazine and the weekly, he became the editor of the weekly and the writer of the Easy Chair. And from those 2 coins of vantage, until his death on August 31, 1892, he did what, apart from his lectures and addresses, was the work of his life. He made no more books save the one not successful novel of Trumps, written as a serial for the weekly, and the volumes from the addresses and the Easy Chair, published after his death. Yet he fulfilled the prophecy of Hawthorne on the appearance of the Nile Notes: "I see that you are forever an author." It would not be easy, were it worth while, exactly to classify Curtis, and if in general phrase we say that he was an essayist, that only betrays how comprehensive a label is needed to cover his work. Essays, long or short, the greater number of his writings were; each practically embraced a single subject, and of this presented one phase, important perhaps and grave, or light, amusing, tender, and sometimes satiric to the verge of bitterness, though never beyond it. The Audiobooks, which first gave him a name and fairly launched him as a writer, were a singular and original product, wholly different from what could have been expected of his training and associations; a venture in a field which, curiously enough, since the venture was in every sense more than ordinarily successful, he promptly and forever abandoned. "I aimed," he says in one of his private letters, "to represent the essentially sensuous, luxurious, languid, and sense-satisfied spirit of Eastern life." The style was adapted with courage, not to say audacity, to the aim. No American at that time had ever written English so riotously beyond the accepted conventions, so frankly, almost saucily, limited only by what the writer chose to say of what he felt or fancied under the inspiration of the East. Leigh Hunt compared the Nile Notes to Eothen and to Hyperion, but the relation was extravagantly remote. The Audiobooks were as individual as the lavish and brilliant bloom of a plant in the hot rays of the southern spring, and as passing. Once the shining and slightly gaudy flowers were shed, the normal growth proceeded to substantial fruitage. The Potiphar Papers were like the Eastern books in this, that they were at the time a still more successful venture in a field which, if not wholly abandoned by Curtis, was not continuously cultivated, but was only entered occasionally, and never quite in the same spirit. They were a series of satires, fanciful enough in conception, but serious and almost savage in spirit, on the most conspicuous society of the day. Its vulgarity, vanity, shallowness, and stupidity, the qualities inherent in the prevalent rivalry and money spending. They were of marked importance at the time, because they were the brilliant and stinging comment of a gentleman and a patriot on a portion of society whose wealth gave dangerous prominence to the false standards set up and followed. Happily, the vices Curtis scourged were those of an over-vigorous and unchastened youth of society, and the chief value of the satire now is as a picture of the past. Prue and I was a series of papers written, as Curtis's letters show, in odd moments and with great rapidity to meet the exigencies of the magazine. But the papers survive as an example of the pure literary work of the author. The opulence and extravagance of the Audiobooks disappear, but the rich imagination, the sportive fancy, the warm and life-giving sentiment, the broad philosophy, are expressed in a style of singular beauty, flexibility, and strength. And it was in this line that the Easy Chair essays were continued, forming one of the most remarkable bodies of literary product of the time. They were written for Harper's Magazine, 4 or 5 monthly, equivalent each year to an ordinary 12mo volume, and the series closed with the death of the writer, some 35 years from their beginning. Their variety was very great. Some of them touch the events and questions of the time, and the time embraced the political contest with slavery, the Civil War, and the marvelously rapid and complex development of the nation after the war. But when the events or questions of the day were touched, it was at once lightly and broadly, to illuminate and fix some suggestion of philosophy. Through all ran the current of wise and gracious and noble thought or sentiment. Many of the essays were woven of reminiscence and comment on persons. In the little volume selected by himself and published shortly before his death, a dozen of the 27 were of this nature, embracing such varying personalities as Edward Everett, Browning, Wendell Phillips, Dickens, Thoreau, Jenny Lind, Emerson, Joseph Jefferson. Whoever was thus brought under the clear, soft, penetrating light of Curtis's pen lived thereafter in the mind of the reader with a character more real and just. In many of the essays of The Easy Chair there was a tone of gentle satire, but always hopeful and helpful, not bitter or discouraging, as if in Titbottom's spectacles, that broke the heart of the wearer with their revelation of the evil in those who passed before them. New lenses had been set, revealing the everlasting beauty and power of the ideal which evil violates, and to whose gracious and blessing sway the writer, with a kindly smile at the incongruities of the actual, invited his friend the reader. The very title had a gleam of this subtle humor, it being well known to the profession, and established by the experience of successive generations, that in reality there is no such thing as an editor's easy chair. Even if we allow for the fact that Curtis's seat was in his tranquil library on Staten Island, remote from the complications and vexations of the magazine's office, we must still recognize that the ease was not in the chair, but in that firm, high poise of the writer's spirit, which enabled him, with wisdom as unfailing as his gracious cheer, to report and consider all matters of what kind soever. Curtis was, perhaps, in his lifetime, even more widely known as a speaker than as a writer. At the very outset of his career he became one of the half-dozen lecturers under the curious and potent lyceum system, that in the third quarter of the century did so much to arouse and satisfy a deep interest in things of the mind in the widely scattered communities of the American Republic. At the very outset, too, he entered with all his soul into the political agitation against slavery, and became one of the most stirring and most highly regarded popular orators of the Republican party. Later he was eagerly sought upon occasions of historical interest and for memorial addresses. Still later he delivered the remarkable series of addresses on the reform of the civil service, in what was in effect a second struggle for political emancipation, waged with as broad a human purpose, with as high courage as was the struggle against slavery, and with even a riper knowledge of the conditions of safety for the Republic. The great body of these addresses, many of the slightest as well as the more elaborate, were essentially literary. Most of them were written out and committed to memory, and many were marked by more of the polish and completeness of the scholar's conscientious and deliberate work than most of the writing intended only for publication. But they were still the orator's work, addressed to the ear, though fitted to bear the test of study, and intended through the ear to touch the conscience and the heart and sway the will. Apart from the unfailing and lofty moral purpose that pervades them, their lasting charm lies in their music. They were the Emelia, the well-tuned speech of the Greeks. But the hidden monitor who kept the orator true to the carefully chosen pitch was not the freedman of Gracchus. It was the sensitive and faithful artistic sense of the speaker. A writer lives in the world's literature necessarily by those of his writings that find a permanent form in books. Of these Curtis left few, but fairly to judge of his influence on the thought, and so on the life as well as the literature of his country, we must remember that the unusual gifts and the rare spirit revealed in these few books pervaded also his work in the magazine and the journal; that the fruit of his work would fill 100 volumes, and that it reached readers by the 100,000. Had Curtis sought only the fame of the writer, he could hardly have failed to gain it, and in notable measure. In pursuing the object he did, he might rightly believe at the close of his career, it is doubtful if he ever gave it a thought, that he had rendered to American literature a service unrecognized and untraceable, but singularly, perhaps uniquely great. End of Section 33. Section 34 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. Section 34. Selection: The Mist at Newport by George William Curtis. From Lotus Eating. Copyright 1852 by Harper & Brothers. I rode one afternoon with Undine along the southern shore of the island, by the lonely graves of which I have spoken. We could see only a few feet over the water, but the ocean constantly plunged sullenly out of the heavy fog, which was full of hoarse roars and wailings, the chaotic sound of the sea. We took the homeward path through the solitary fields, just unfamiliar enough to excite us with a vague sense of going astray. At times, gleams of sunlight, bewildered like ourselves, struggled, surprised, through the mist, and disappeared. But strange and beautiful were those estrays, and I well understand why Turner studied vapors so long and carefully. Two grander figures are not in contemporary biography than that of Coleridge in Carlyle's Starling, looking out from Highgate over the mingled smoke and vapor which buries London, as in lava Pompeii is buried; and that of Turner in some anonymous but accurate sketches of his latter days, at his cottage on the edge of London, where, apart from his fame and under a feigned name, he sat by day and night upon the housetop, watching the sun glorify the vapors and the smoke with the same splendor that he lavishes upon the evening west, and which we deemed the special privilege of the sky. Those two men, greatest in their kind among their companions, illustrate with happy force what Wordsworth sang: In common things that round us lie, some random truths he can impart, the harvest of a quiet eye that broods and sleeps on his own heart. Gazing from his Highgate window with large gray eye, did Coleridge see more than the image of his own mind and his own career in that limitless city, wide sparkling, many turreted, fading and mingling in shining mist, with strange voices calling from its clouds, the solemn peal of cathedral chimes, and the low voice of the vesper bell. And out of that London fog, with its irresistible splendors, and out of the holy vapors which float serene amid the Alps, has Turner quarried his colossal fame. There is no grander lesson in any history of any art than the spectacle of the greatest painter of our time, sitting upon his housetop, and from the mist which to others was but a clog and inconvenience, and associated in all men's minds only with link-boys and lanterns, plucking the heart of its mystery and making it worshipped and remembered. Selection: Nazareth, by George William Curtis. From Hawajian Syria. Copyright 1856 by Harper & Brothers. The traditions which cluster around Nazareth are so tender and domestic that you will willingly believe, or at least you will listen to, the improbable stories of the friars as a father to the enthusiastic exaggerations of his child. With Jerusalem and its vicinity the gravity of the doctrine is too intimately associated to allow the mind to heed the quarrels and theories about the localities. It is the grandeur of the thought which commands you. But in Nazareth it is the personality of the teacher which interests you. All the tenderness of the story centers here. The youth of the Madonna and the unrecorded years of the child belong to Nazareth. Therefore, imagination unbends to the sweet associations of domestic life. The little picture in the Uffizi recurs again, and the delicate sketches of Overbeck, illustrating the life of Christ, in which, as a blooming boy in his father's shop, he saws a bit of wood into the form of a cross, looking up smilingly to the thoughtful Joseph and the yearning Mary, as when he brings her the passion flower in the pleasant room. The tranquil afternoon streams up the valley, and your heart is softened as if by that tender smile of Mary, and yielding to soliciting friars, you go quietly and see where Joseph's house stood, and where the angel Gabriel saluted Mary, and the chimney of the hearth upon which she warmed food for her young child, and baked cakes for Joseph when he came home from work, and the rock whence the Jews wished to cast Jesus, and another rock upon which he ate with his disciples. You listen quietly to these stories and look at the sights. The childish effort to give plausible form to the necessary facts of the history of the place is too natural to offend. When the pretense is too transparent, you smile, but do not scold. For whether he lived upon this side of the way or upon that, this is the landscape he saw for 30 years. A quiet workman, doubtless, with his father, strolling among the melancholy hills of Galilee, looking down into the lake-like vastness of Esdraelon, where the great captains of his nation had fought, hearing the wild winds blow from the sea, watching the stars, and remembering the 3 days of his childhood when he sat in the temple at Jerusalem. Walking in the dying day over the same solitary hills, you will see in the sunset but one figure moving along the horizon, a grave manly form, outlined upon the west. Here was the true struggle of his life, the resolve to devote himself to the work. These are the exceeding high mountains upon which he was lifted in temptation. Here, in the fullness of his youth and hope, Satan walked with him, seductive. For every sin smiles in the first address, says Jeremy Taylor, and carries light in the face and honey in the lip. Green and flowery as Esdraelon lay the valleys of ease and reputation at his feet, but sternly precipitous as the heights of Galilee, the cliffs of duty above him buried their heads in heaven. Here, too, was he transfigured, and in the light of thought he floats between Moses and Elias, between faith and duty, and the splendor of his devotion so overflows history with glory that men call him God. Selection: Aurelia as a Grandmother, by George William Curtis. From Prue and I. Copyright 1856 by Harper and Brothers. There will be a time when you will no longer go out to dinner, or only very quietly in the family. I shall be gone then, but other old bookkeepers in white cravats will inherit my tastes, and saunter on summer afternoons to see what I love to see. They will not pause, I fear, in buying apples, to look at the old lady in venerable cap who is rolling by in the carriage. They will worship another Aurelia. You will not wear diamonds or opals any more, only one pearl upon your blue-veined finger, your engagement ring. Grave clergymen and antiquated beaux will hand you down to dinner, and the group of polished youth who gather around the yet unborn Aurelia of that day will look at you, sitting quietly upon the sofa, and say softly, "She must have been very handsome in her time." All this must be, for consider how few years since it was your grandmother who was the belle, by whose side the handsome young men longed to sit and pass expressive mottos. Your grandmother was the Aurelia of a half-century ago, although you cannot fancy her young. She is indissolubly associated in your mind with caps and dark dresses. You can believe Mary Queen of Scots, or Nell Gwynn, or Cleopatra to have been young and blooming, although they belonged to old and dead centuries, but not your grandmother. Think of those who shall believe the same of you, you who today are the very flower of youth. Might I plead with you, Aurelia, I, who would be too happy to receive one of those graciously beaming bows that I see you bestow upon young men in passing? I would ask you to bear that thought with you always, not to sadden your sudden smile, but to give it a more subtle grace. Wear in your summer garland this little leaf of rue. It will not be the skull at the feast. It will rather be the tender thoughtfulness in the face of the young Madonna. For the years pass like summer clouds, Aurelia, and the children of yesterday are the wives and mothers of today. Even I do sometimes discover the mild eyes of my Prue fixed pensively upon my face, as if searching for the bloom which she remembers there in the days, long ago, when we were young. She will never see it there again, any more than the flowers she held in her hand in our old spring rambles. Yet the tear that slowly gathers as she gazes is not grief that the bloom has faded from my cheek, but the sweet consciousness that it can never fade from my heart. And as her eyes fall upon her work again, or the children climb her lap to hear the old fairy tales they already know by heart, my wife Prue is dearer to me than the sweetheart of those days long ago. Selection: Prue's Magnolia by George William Curtis. From Prue and I. Copyright 1892 by Harper and Brothers. If I meet Charles, who is bound for Alabama, or John, who sails for Savannah with a trunk full of white jackets, I do not say to them, as their other friends say, "Happy travelers, who cut March and April out of the dismal year." I do not envy them. They will be seasick on the way. The southern winds will blow all the water out of the rivers, and desolately stranded upon mud, they will relieve the tedium of the interval by tying with large ropes a young gentleman raving with delirium tremens. They will hurry along, appalled by forests blazing in the windy night. And housed in a bad inn, they will find themselves anxiously asking, "Are the cars punctual in leaving?" Grimly sure that impatient travelers find all conveyances too slow. The travelers are very warm indeed, even in March and April, but Prue doubts if it is altogether the effect of the southern climate. Why should they go to the south? If they only wait a little, the south will come to them. Savannah arrives in April, Florida in May. Cuba and the Gulf come in with June, and the full splendor of the tropics burns through July and August. Sitting upon the earth, do we not glide by all the constellations, all the awful stars? Does not the flash of Orion's scimitar dazzle as we pass? Do we not hear, as we gaze in hushed midnights, the music of the lyre? Are we not throned with Cassiopeia? Do we not play with the tangles of Berenice's hair as we sail, as we sail? When Christopher told me that he was going to Italy, I went into Burns' conservatory, saw a magnolia, and so reached Italy before him. Can Christopher bring Italy home? But I brought to Prue a branch of magnolia blossoms, with Mr. Burns' kindest regards, and she put them upon her table, and our little house smelled of Italy for a week afterward. The incident developed Prue's Italian tastes, which I had not suspected to be so strong. I found her looking very often at the magnolias, even holding them in her hand, and standing before the table with a pensive air. I suppose she was thinking of Beatrice Cenci, or of Tasso and Leonora, or of the wife of Marino Faliero, or of some other of those sad old Italian tales of love and woe. So easily Prue went to Italy. Thus the spring comes in my heart as well as in the air, and leaps along my veins as well as through the trees. I immediately travel. An orange takes me to Sorrento, and roses when they blow to Paestum. The camellias in Aurelia's hair bring Brazil into the happy rooms she treads, and she takes me to South America as she goes to dinner. The pearls upon her neck make me free of the Persian Gulf. Upon her shawl, like the Arabian prince upon his carpet, I am transported to the vales of Kashmir. And thus, as I daily walk in the bright spring days, I go around the world. But the season wakes a finer longing, a desire that could only be satisfied if the pavilions of the clouds were real, and I could stroll among the towering splendors of a sultry spring evening. Ah, if I could leap those flaming battlements that glow along the west! If I could tread those cool, dewy, serene isles of sunset, and sink with them in the sea of stars! I say so to Prue, and my wife smiles. Selection: Our Cousin the Curate, by George William Curtis, from Prue and I. Copyright 1856 by Harper & Brothers. When Prue and I are most cheerful, and the world looks fair, we talk of our cousin the curate. When the world seems a little cloudy, and we remember that though we have lived and loved together, we may not die together, we talk of our cousin the curate. When we plan little plans for the boys, and dream dreams for the girls, we talk of our cousin the curate. When I tell Prue of Aurelia, whose character is every day lovelier, we talk of our cousin the curate. There is no subject which does not seem to lead naturally to our cousin the curate. As the soft air steals in and envelops everything in the world, so that the trees and the hills and the rivers, the cities, the crops, and the sea are made remote and delicate and beautiful by its pure baptism, so over all the events of our little lives, comforting, refining, and elevating, falls like a benediction the remembrance of our cousin the curate. He was my only early companion. He had no brother, I had none, and we became brothers to each other. He was always beautiful. His face was symmetrical and delicate. His figure was slight and graceful. He looked as the sons of kings ought to look, as I am sure Philip Sidney looked when he was a boy. His eyes were blue, and as you looked at them they seemed to let your gaze out into a June heaven. The blood ran close to the skin, and his complexion had the rich transparency of light. There was nothing gross or heavy in his expression or texture. His soul seemed to have mastered his body. But he had strong passions, for his delicacy was positive, not negative. It was not weakness, but intensity. There was a patch of ground about the house which we tilled as a garden. I was proud of my morning glories and sweet peas. My cousin cultivated roses. One day, and we could scarcely have been more than 6 years old, we were digging merrily and talking. Suddenly there was some kind of difference. I taunted him, and raising his spade, he struck me upon the leg. The blow was heavy for a boy, and the blood trickled from the wound. I burst into indignant tears and limped toward the house. My cousin turned pale and said nothing, but just as I opened the door he darted by me, and before I could interrupt him he had confessed his crime and asked for punishment. From that day he conquered himself. He devoted a kind of ascetic energy to subduing his own will, and I remember no other outbreak. But the penalty he paid for conquering his will was a loss of the gushing expression of feeling. My cousin became perfectly gentle in his manner, but there was a want of that pungent excess which is the finest flavor of character. His views were moderate and calm. He was swept away by no more boyish extravagance. And even while I wished he would sin only a very little, I still adored him as a saint. The truth is, as I tell Prue, I am so very bad because I have to sin for two, for myself and our cousin the curate. Often when I returned panting and restless from some frolic which had wasted almost all the night, I was rebuked as I entered the room in which he lay peacefully sleeping. There was something holy in the profound repose of his beauty, and as I stood looking at him, how many a time the tears have dropped from my hot eyes upon his face, while I vowed to make myself worthy of such a companion, for I felt my heart owning its allegiance to that strong and imperial nature. My cousin was loved by the boys, but the girls worshipped him. His mind, large in grasp and subtle in perception, naturally commanded his companions, while the luster of his character allured those who could not understand him. The asceticism occasionally showed itself in a vein of hardness, or rather of severity, in his treatment of others. He did what he thought it his duty to do, but he forgot that few could see the right so clearly as he, and very few of those few could so calmly obey the least command of conscience. I confess I was a little afraid of him, for I think I never could be severe. In the long winter evenings I often read to Prue the story of some old father of the church, or some quaint poem of George Herbert's, and every Christmas Eve I read to her Milton's Hymn of the Nativity. Yet when the saint seems to us most saintly, or the poem most pathetic or sublime, we find ourselves talking of our cousin the curate. I have not seen him for many years, but when we parted his head had the intellectual symmetry of Milton's, without the puritanic stoop, and with the stately grace of a cavalier. Selection: The Charm of Paris by George William Curtis, from The Potiphar Papers, copyright 1858, by Harper and Brothers. "Yes, my dear madame," answered the Pasha, "this is indeed making the best of one's opportunities. This is well worth coming to Europe for. It is in fact for this that Europe is chiefly valuable to an American, as the experience of an observer shows. Paris is notoriously the great center of historical and romantic interest. To be sure, Italy, Rome, Switzerland, and Germany, yes, and even England, have some few objects of interest and attention. But the really great things of Europe, the superior interests, are all in Paris. Why, just reflect. Here is the Café de Paris, the Trois Frères, and the Maison Dorée. I don't think you can get such dinners elsewhere. Then there is the Grand Opera, the Comic Opera, and now and then the Italian. I rather think that is good music. Are there any such theatres as the Vaudeville, the Variété, and the Montansier, where there is the most dexterous balancing on the edge of decency that ever you saw? And when the balance is lost, as it always is at least a dozen times every evening, the applause is tremendous, showing that the audience have such a subtle sense of propriety that they can detect the slightest deviation from the right line. Is there not the Louvre, where, if there is not the best picture of a single great artist, there are good specimens of all? Will you please to show me such a promenade as the Boulevard, such fêtes as those of the Champs-Élysées, such shops as those of the Passage and the Palais Royal? Above all, will you indicate to such students of mankind as Mr. Boosey, Mr. Firkin, and I, a city more abounding in piquant little women with eyes, and coiffeurs, and toilettes, and je ne sais quoi, enough to make Diogenes a dandy, to obtain their favor? I think, dear Madame, you would be troubled to do it. And while these things are Paris, while we are sure of an illimitable allowance of all this in the gay capital, we do right to remain here. Let who will sadden in mouldy old Rome, or luxuriate in the orange groves of Sorrento and the South, or wander among the ruins of the most marvelous of empires, and the monuments of art of the highest human genius, or float about the canals of Venice, or woo the Venus and the Apollo, and learn from the silent lips of those teachers a lore sweeter than the French novelists impart. Let who will climb the tremendous Alps and feel the sublimity of Switzerland as he rises from the summer of Italian lakes and vineyards into the winter of the glaciers, or makes the tour of all climates in a day by descending those mountains towards the south. Let those who care for it explore in Germany the sources of modern history and the remote beginnings of the American spirit. Ours be the boulevards, the demoiselles, the operas, and the unequaled dinners. Decency requires that we should seek Rome and climb an Alp. We will devote a summer week to the one, and a winter month to the other. They will restore us, renewed and refreshed, for the manly, generous, noble, and useful life we lead in Paris. Selection: Pharisaism of Reform by George William Curtis. From Orations and Addresses. Copyright 1893 by Harper & Brothers. No American, it seems to me, is so unworthy the name as he who attempts to extenuate or defend any national abuse, who denies or tries to hide it, or who derides as pessimists and Pharisees those who indignantly disown it and raise the cry of reform. If a man proposes the redress of any public wrong, he is asked severely whether he considers himself so much wiser and better than other men, that he must disturb the existing order and pose as a saint. If he denounces an evil, he is exhorted to beware of spiritual pride. If he points out a dangerous public tendency, or censures the action of a party, he is advised to cultivate good humor, to look on the bright side, to remember that the world is a very good world, at least the best going, and very much better than it was 100 years ago. Undoubtedly it is. But would it have been better if everybody had then insisted that it was the best of all possible worlds, and that we must not despond if sometimes a cloud gathered in the sky, or a Benedict Arnold appeared in the patriot army, or even a Judas Iscariot among the chosen 12? Christ, I think, did not doubt the beloved disciple, nor the coming of his kingdom, although he knew and said that the betrayer sat with him at the table. I believe we do not read that Washington either thought it wiser that Arnold's treachery should be denied or belittled. or that he or any other patriot despaired, although the treason was so grave. Julius Caesar, or Marlborough, or Frederick would hardly be called a great general if he had rebuked the soldier who reported that the lines were beginning to break. When the sea is pouring into the ship through an open seam, everybody is aware of it. But then it is too late. It is the watch who reports the first starting of the seam who saves the ship. It is an ill sign when public men find in exposure and denunciation of public abuses evidence of the Pharisaic disposition, and a tendency in the critic to think himself holier than other men. Was Martin Luther, cheerfully defending his faith against the princes of Christendom, a Pharisee? Were the English Puritans, iconoclasts in church and state, but saviors of liberty, pessimists? Were Patrick Henry demanding liberty or death, and Wendell Phillips in the night of slavery murmuring the music of the morning, birds of ill omen? Was Abraham Lincoln saying of the American Union, "A house divided with itself cannot stand," assuming to be holier than other Americans? To win a cheap cheer, I have known even intelligent men to sneer at the scholar in politics. But in a republic founded upon the common school, such a sneer seems to me to show a momentary loss of common sense. It implies that the political opinions of educated men are unimportant, and that ignorance is a safer counselor of the republic. If the gentleman who in this very hall last stooped to that sneer had asked himself what would have been the fortune of this state and this country without its educated leadership, from Samuel Adams to Charles Sumner, both sons of Massachusetts, both scholars in politics from Harvard College, he might have spared his country, his party, and himself the essential recreancy to America and to manhood which lies in a sneer at education. To the cant about the Pharisaism of reform, there is one short and final answer. The man who tells the truth is a holier man than the liar. The man who does not steal is a better man than the thief. Selection: The Call of Freedom by George William Curtis, from Orations and Addresses, copyright 1893, by Harper & Brothers. Into how many homes along this lovely valley came the news of Lexington and Bunker Hill 80 years ago, and young men like us, studious, fond of leisure, young lovers, young husbands, young brothers and sons, knew that they must forsake the wooded hillside, the river meadows golden with harvest, the twilight walk along the river, the summer Sunday in the old church, parents, wife, child, mistress, and go away to uncertain war. Putnam heard the call at his plow, and turned to go without waiting. Worcester heard it and obeyed. Not less lovely in those days was this peaceful valley, not less soft this summer air. Life was as dear and love as beautiful to those young men as to us who stand upon their graves. But because they were so dear and beautiful, those men went out bravely to fight for them and fall. Through these very streets they marched, who never returned. They fell and were buried, but they never can die. Not sweeter are the flowers that make your valley fair, not greener are the pines that give your river its name, than the memory of the brave men who died for freedom. And yet no victim of those days, sleeping under the green sod of Connecticut, is more truly a martyr of liberty than every murdered man, whose bones lie bleaching in this summer sun upon the silent plains of Kansas. Gentlemen, while we read history, we make history. Because our fathers fought in this great cause, we must not hope to escape fighting. Because 2000 years ago Leonidas stood against Xerxes, we must not suppose that Xerxes was slain, nor, thank God, that Leonidas is not immortal. Every great crisis of human history is a pass of Thermopylae, and there is always a Leonidas and his 300 to die in it, if they cannot conquer. And so long as liberty has one martyr, so long as one drop of blood is poured out for her, so long from that single drop of bloody sweat, of the agony of humanity, shall spring hosts as countless as the forest leaves, and mighty as the sea. Brothers, the call has come to us. I bring it to you in these calm retreats. I summon you to the great fight of freedom. I call upon you to say with your voices, whenever the occasion offers, and with your votes when the day comes, that upon these fertile fields of Kansas, in the very heart of the continent, the Upas tree of slavery, dripping death dews upon national prosperity and upon free labor, shall never be planted. I call upon you to plant there the palm of peace, the wine and the olive of a Christian civilization. I call upon you to determine whether this great experiment of human freedom, which has been the scorn of despotism, shall by our failure be also our sin and shame. I call upon you to defend the hope of the world. The voice of our brothers who are bleeding, no less than our fathers who bled, summons us to this battle. Shall the children of unborn generations, clustering over that vast Western Empire, rise up and call us blessed or cursed? Here are our Marathon and Lexington. Here are our heroic fields. The hearts of all good men beat with us. The fight is fierce. The issue is with God. But God is good. Selection: Robert Browning in Florence by George William Curtis. From The Easy Chair. Copyright 1891 by Harper & Brothers. It is more than 40 years since Margaret Fuller first gave distinction to the literary notices and reviews of the New York Tribune. Miss Fuller was a woman of extraordinary scholarly attainments and intellectual independence, the friend of Emerson and of the transcendental leaders, and her critical papers were the best then published, and were fitly succeeded by those of her scholarly friend George Ripley. It was her review in the Tribune of Browning's early dramas and The Bells and Pomegranates that introduced him to such general knowledge and appreciation among cultivated readers in this country, that it is not less true of Browning than of Carlyle that he was first better known in America than at home. It was but about 4 years before the publication of Miss Fuller's paper that the Boston issue of Tennyson's 2 volumes had delighted the youth of the time with the consciousness of the appearance of a new English poet. The eagerness and enthusiasm with which Browning was welcomed soon after were more limited in extent, but they were even more ardent, and the devoted zeal of Mr. Levi Thaxter as a Browning missionary and pioneer forecast the interest from which the Browning societies of later days have sprung. When Matthew Arnold was told in a small and remote farming village in New England that there had been a lecture upon Browning in the town the week before, he stopped in amazement and said, "Well, that is the most surprising and significant fact I have heard in America." It was in those early days of Browning's fame, and in the studio of the sculptor Powers in Florence, that the youthful Easy Chair took up a visiting card, and reading the name Mr. Robert Browning, asked with eager earnestness whether it was Browning the poet. Powers turned his large, calm, lustrous eyes upon the youth and answered, with some surprise at the warmth of the question, It is a young Englishman, recently married, who is here with his wife, an invalid. He often comes to the studio." "Good heaven!" exclaimed the youth. "It must be Browning and Elizabeth Barrett." Powers, with the half bewildered air of one suddenly made conscious that he had been entertaining angels unawares, said reflectively, "I think we must have them to tea." The youth begged to take the card which bore the poet's address, and hastening to his room near the Piazza Novella, he wrote a note asking permission for a young American to call and pay his respects to Mr. and Mrs. Browning, but wrote it in terms which, however warm, would yet permit it to be put aside if it seemed impertinent, or if for any reason such a call were not desired. The next morning betimes the note was dispatched, and a half hour had not passed when there was a brisk rap at the Easy Chair's door. He opened it and saw a young man who briskly inquired, "Is Mr. Easy Chair here?" "That is my name." "I am Robert Browning." Browning shook hands heartily with his young American admirer and thanked him for his note. The poet was then about 35. His figure was not large, but compact, erect, and active; the face smooth, the hair dark, the aspect that of active intelligence and of a man of the world. He was in no way eccentric, either in manner or appearance. He talked freely, with great vivacity, and delightfully, rising and walking about the room as his talk sparkled on. He heard with evident pleasure, but with entire simplicity and manliness, of the American interest in his works and in those of Mrs. Browning, and the Easy Chair gave him a copy of Miss Fuller's paper in the Tribune. It was a bright, and to the Easy Chair a wonderfully happy hour. As he went, the poet said that Mrs. Browning would certainly expect to give Mr. Easy Chair a cup of tea in the evening, and with a brisk and gay good-bye, Browning was gone. The Easy Chair blithely hied him to the Café Donné, and ordered of the flower girl the most perfect of nosegays, with such fervor that she smiled; and when she brought the flowers in the afternoon, said with sympathy and meaning, "Eccola, signori, per la donna bellissima." It was not in the Casa Guidi that the Brownings were then living, but in an apartment in the Via della Scala, not far from the place or square most familiar to strangers in Florence, the Piazza Trinita. Through several rooms the Easy Chair passed, Browning leading the way, until at the end they entered a smaller room arranged with an air of English comfort, where at a table, bending over a tea urn, sat a slight lady, her long curls drooping forward. "Here," said Browning, addressing her with a tender diminutive, "here is Mr. Easy Chair." And as the bright eyes but wan face of the lady turned towards him, and she put out her hand, Mr. Easy Chair recalled the first words of her verse he had ever known: "Onora, Onora, her mother is calling. She sits at the lattice and hears the dew falling, drop after drop from the sycamore laden with dew as with blossom, and calls home the maiden. Night cometh, Onora." The most kindly welcome and pleasant chat followed, Browning's gaiety dashing and flashing in, with a sense of profuse and bubbling vitality, glancing at 100 topics; and when there was some allusion to his Sordello, he asked quickly with an amused smile, "Have you read it?" The Easy Chair pleaded that he had not seen it. "So much the better. Nobody understands it. Don't read it, except in the revised form, which is coming." The revised form has come long ago, and the Easy Chair has read, and probably supposes that he understands. But Thackeray used to say that he did not read Browning because he could not comprehend him, adding ruefully, "I have no head above my eyes." A few days later, O gift of God, O perfect day! The Easy Chair went with Mr. and Mrs. Browning to Vallombrosa and the one incident most clearly remembered is that of Browning's seating himself at the organ in the chapel, and playing some Gregorian chant perhaps, or hymn of Pergolices. It was enough to the enchanted eyes of his young companion that they saw him who was already a great English poet sitting at the organ where the young Milton had sat, and touching the very keys which Milton's hand had pressed. End of Section 34.
Section 35 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. Section 35. Selected Works by Ernst Curtius. Ernst Curtius, 1814 to 1896. Ernst Curtius, a noted German archaeologist and historian, was born at Lübeck, September 2, 1814. He studied philology at Bonn, Göttingen, and Berlin. When in 1837 Christian August Brandis was appointed confidential advisor to Prince Otho of Bavaria, the newly elected king of Greece, Curtius accompanied Brandis's family to Athens as a private tutor. He remained with the Brandises until 1840, when he joined Ottfried Müller's archaeological expedition to Delphi. No sooner were the excavations well under way, however, than Müller died. Curtius thereupon returned to Germany, stopping at Rome on the way, and in 1841 took his doctor's degree at Halle. In 1844 he was appointed tutor to the Crown Prince of Prussia, the late Emperor Frederick, being at the same time made a professor extraordinary at the University of Berlin. He held his position as tutor to the Crown Prince until 1850, when the latter matriculated at Bonn. In 1856 he succeeded Hermann as professor of classical philology at Göttingen, but returned some 12 years later to Berlin to occupy the chair of classical archaeology and to act as director of the Cabinet of Antiquities in the Royal Museum. Curtius also much advanced the study of classical archaeology as presiding officer of the Archaeological Society, as editor of the Archaeological Journal, as perpetual secretary of the Royal Academy, and as the founder of the German Archaeological Institute at Athens. He undertook a number of scientific missions in the service of the Prussian government, and in 1874 concluded with the Greek government a convention which secured to the German Empire for a term of years the exclusive right to make excavations in the Greek kingdom. The following year, the first excavation was begun at Olympia in Elis, the site of the ancient Olympic Games, under the direction of Curtius, who, with others, published the results in a voluminous and most interesting report. Curtius' chief work is his History of Greece, which appeared in 1867. It was originally published in 3 volumes as one of a series of manuals for classical students issued by a Berlin house, and was consequently intended for popular use, a circumstance that necessitated the omission of the copious notes in which the text of a German scientific work is commonly lost. It showed a remarkable familiarity with the climate, resources, and physical characteristics of Greece, and interpreted ancient life with much eloquence from the classical literature and from the monuments of ancient art. But the monarchical leaning of the author prevented him from entering fully into and appreciating the public life of the democratic communities which he described, and his enthusiastic temperament led him sometimes to exaggerate and to be too eager a partisan, to accept unproven hypotheses too readily and press them too hard. Besides his History of Greece, Curtius's most notable works are Peloponnesos, 1850-1851, which describes in detail the ancient remains of the Peloponnesus, the Stadtgeschichte von Athen, Municipal History of Athens, 1891, and 7 Karten zur Topographie von Athen nebst erläuterndem Text, 7 Maps of Athens, 1886. His life was a busy and eminently distinguished one, as an archaeologist, historian, and instructor, and his death in the summer of 1896 was generally lamented by his associates. The causes of dislike towards Socrates from the history of Greece. The Athenians disliked men who wished to be different from everyone else, particularly when these eccentrics, instead of quietly pursuing their own path and withdrawing from the world like Timon, forced themselves among their neighbors and assumed towards them the attitude of pedagogues, as Socrates did. For what could be more annoying to an Athenian of repute than to find himself, on his way to the council meeting or the law court, unexpectedly involved in a conversation intended to confuse him, to shake his comfortable self-assurance, and to end by making him ridiculous? In any other city such conversation would have been altogether hard to manage, but at Athens the love of talk was so great that many allowed themselves to be caught, and that gradually the number became very large of those who had been the victims of this inconvenient questioner, and who carried about with them the remembrance of a humiliation inflicted on them by him. And most of all was he hated by those who had allowed themselves to be touched and moved to tears of a bitter recognition of their own selves by his words, but who had afterwards sunk back into their former ways and were now ashamed of their hours of weakness. Thus Socrates had daily to experience that the testing of men was the most ungrateful of tasks which could be pursued at Athens. Nor could he, without the sacred resolution of an absolutely unselfish devotion to his mission, have without ceasing obeyed the divine voice which every morning anew bade him go forth among men. But that there were also more general and deep-seated grounds for the sense of annoyance manifested by the Attic public is most clearly proved by the attacks of the comic state. To me too, it is said in a comedy by Eupolis, this Socrates is offensive, this beggarly talker who has considered everything with hair-splitting ingenuity. The only matter which he has left unconsidered is the question how he will get a dinner today. Far more serious were the attacks of Aristophanes. His standpoint, as well as that of Eupolis and Cratinus, was the ancient Attic view of life. He regarded the teachers of philosophy, round whom the young men gathered, as the ruin of the state. And although he could not possibly mistake the difference between Socrates and the sophists, although, moreover, he by no means belonged to the personal enemies of Socrates, with whom he rather seemed to have enjoyed a certain degree of intimacy, yet he thought it both his right and his duty, as a poet and a patriot, to combat in Socrates the sophist, nay, the most dangerous of sophists. The Athenian of the old school hated these conversations, extending through whole hours of the broad daylight, during which the young men were kept away from the palaestrae. These painful discussions of topics of morality and politics, as to which it behooved every loyal citizen to have made up his mind once for all. If everything was submitted to examination, everything was also exposed to rejection. And what was to become of the city, if only that was to be allowed as valid which found gracious acceptance at the hands of this or that professor of talk? If everything had to be learned, if everything was to be acquired by reflection, then there was an end of true civic virtue, which ought to be a thing inborn in a citizen and secured by his training as such. In these days, all action and capability of action was being dissolved into an idle knowledge. The one-sided cultivation of the intellect was loosening the sinews of men and making them indifferent to their country and religion. From this standpoint, the poet rejects all such culture of youth as is founded upon the testing of the mind and leading it to perfect knowledge, and lauds those young Athenians who do not care for wasting their time by sitting and talking with Socrates. The priestly party, again, was adverse to Socrates, although the highest authority in religious matters which existed in Hellas, and had at all events not been superseded by any other, had declared in his favor, at the suggestion of Chaerephon, who from his youth up was attached with devoted affection to his teacher. His was an enthusiastic nature, and he desired nothing so ardently as that the beneficent influence which he had experienced in his own soul might be shared by the largest possible number of his fellow citizens. For this reason he was anxious for an outward recognition of the merits of his so frequently misjudged friend, and he is said to have brought home from Delphi the oracle which declared Socrates to be the wisest of all men. Now, although this oracle was incapable of giving a loftier assurance of his mission to the philosopher himself, although it could not even remove the antipathy of the public, yet it might be expected that it would disarm the calumny representing Socrates as a teacher of dangerous heresies, and in this sense he could not but personally welcome the Delphic declaration, for it must be remembered that he continued to regard the oracle as the reverend center of the nation, as the symbol of a religious communion among the Hellenes, and in disallowing all presumptuous meditation on the right way of venerating the gods, he entirely followed the precedent of the Delphic oracle, which was in the habit of settling questions of this kind by the answer that it was according to the usage of their fathers that men should venerate the gods. At Delphi, on the other hand, there could be no question as to the importance of one who was leading the revolted world back to reverence for things holy, and who, while his contemporaries were derisively despising the obsolete ways of the past and running after the ignis fatui of the wisdom of the day, held up before their eyes the primitive sayings of the temples, a serious consideration of which he declared to be sufficient to reveal the treasure of immortal truth contained in them. If it was confessedly impossible to put an end to the prevailing desire for independent inquiry, then the priests could not but acknowledge that this was the only way by which the old religion could be saved. Even the recognition by Delphi, however, was unable to protect Socrates against the suspicion of heresy. The fanaticism of the priestly party increased in inverse ratio to its prospects of real success. It regarded any philosophical discussion of religious truths as a desecration, and placed Socrates on the same level as Diagoras. Finally, the Democrats, who after the restoration of the Constitution were the ruling party, hated philosophy, because out of its school had issued a large proportion of the oligarchs, not only Critias and Theramenes, but also Pythagoras, the archon of the days of anarchy, Aristoteles, one of the 400 and of the 30, Charmides, and others were known as men of philosophical culture. Philosophy and the tendency towards political reaction accordingly seem to be necessarily connected with one another. In a word, Socrates found opposition everywhere. Some deemed him too conservative, and others too liberal. He had against him both the sophists and the enemies of the sophists, both rigid orthodoxy and infidelity, both the patriots of the old school and the representatives of the renovated democracy. Notwithstanding all this hostile feeling, the personal security of Socrates was not endangered, because he pursued his path as a blameless man, and because it was a matter of conscience with him to avoid every offense against the law. But after the restoration of the Constitution, a variety of circumstances continued to imperil his position at Athens. Socrates as an influence and as a man, from the History of Greece. If we contemplate Socrates in his whole way of living and being, and in truth no other personage of Greek antiquity is so distinctly brought before our eyes, it seems to us, in the first place, as if at Athens he were not in his natural place. So foreign to Athens are his ways, and so dissociated from it is his whole individuality. He cannot be fitted into any class of Athenian civil society, and is to be measured by no such standard as we apply to his fellow citizens. He is one of the poorest of all the Athenians, and yet he passes with a proud step through the streets of the city, and confronts the richest and best born as their equal. His ungainly and neglected exterior makes him an object of public derision, and yet he exercises an unexampled influence upon high and low, upon learned and unlearned alike. He is a master both of thought and of speech, yet at the same time an opponent on principle of those who were the instructors of the Athenians in both. He is a man of free thought, who allows nothing to remain untested, and yet he is more diligent in offering sacrifices than any of his neighbors. He venerates the oracles and reposes a simple faith in many things which the age laughs at as nursery tales. He blames without reticence the dominion of the multitude, and yet is an adversary of oligarchs. Entirely his own master, he thinks differently from all other Athenians. He goes his own path without troubling himself about public opinion. And so long as he remains in harmony with himself, no contradiction, no hostile attack, no derision vexes his soul. Such a man as this seemed in truth to have been transplanted into the midst of Athens as it were from some other world. And yet, unique in his kind as this Socrates was, we are unable on closer examination to mistake him for aught but a genuine Athenian. Such he was in his whole intellectual tendency, in his love of talk and skill in talk, growths impossible in any but Athenian air, in the delicate wit with which he contrived to combine the serious and the sportive, and in his unflagging search after a deep connection between action and knowledge. He was a genuine Athenian of the ancient stamp, when, with inflexible courage, he stood forth as the champion of the laws of the state against all arbitrary interference, and in the field shrank from no danger or hardship. He knew and loved the national poets, but above all, it is in his indefatigable impulse towards culture that we recognize the true son of his native city. Herein lay a spiritual affinity between him and the noblest among the Athenians, a Solon and a Pericles. Socrates, like Solon, thought that no man is too old to learn, that to learn and to know is not a schooling for life, but life itself, and that which alone gives to life its value. To become by knowledge better from day to day, and to make others better, appeared to both to be the real duty of men. Both found the one true happiness in the health of the soul, whose greatest unhappiness they held to lie in wrong and ignorance. Thus, with all his originality, Socrates most decidedly stood on the basis of Attic culture, and, if it is taken into consideration that the most celebrated representatives of sophistry and the tendencies akin to it all came from abroad, for example, Protagoras from Abdera, Prodicus from Chios, Diagoras from Melos, it may fairly be affirmed that, as against these foreign teachers, the best principles of Attic wisdom found their representative in Socrates. Far, however, from merely recurring to the ancient foundations of patriotic sentiment, fallen into neglect to the great loss of the state, and from opposing himself on an inflexible defensive to the movement of the age, he rather stood in the very midst of it, and merely sought to lead it to other and higher ends. What he desired was not a turning back, but a progress in knowledge beyond that which the most sagacious teachers of wisdom offered. For this reason he was able to unite in himself elements which seemed to others irreconcilably contradictory. And upon this conception was based what most distinguished him above all his fellow countrymen, the lofty freedom and independence of his mind. Thus, without becoming disloyal to his home, he was able to rise above the restrictions of customary ideas, which he most notably achieved by making himself perfectly independent of all external things, in the midst of a people which worshipped the beauty of outward appearance, and by attaching value exclusively to the possessions which are within, and to moral life. For this reason, too, his personal ugliness, the broad face with the snub nose, thick lips, and prominent eyes, was a characteristic feature of his individuality, because it testified against the traditional assumption of a necessary union between physical and intellectual excellence, because it proved that even in a form like that of Silenus there might dwell a spirit like that of Apollo, and thus conduced to a loftier conception of the being of man. Thus he belonged to his people and to his age, but stood above both. And such a man the Athenians needed, in order to find the path whereon it was possible to penetrate through the conflict of opinions to a moral assurance, and to reach a happiness containing its own warrant. Socrates appears before us as an individuality complete and perfect, of which the gradual development continues to remain a mystery. Its real germ, however, doubtless lies in the desire for knowledge, which was innate in him with peculiar strength. This desire would not allow him to remain under pupilage to his father. It drove him forth out of the narrow workshop into the streets and the open places of the city, where, in those days, every kind of culture, art, and science was offered in rich abundance. For at the time when Socrates was in his 20th year, Pericles stood at the height of his splendid activity, which the son of a sculptor might be supposed to have had occasion fully to appreciate. The youthful Socrates, however, brought with him out of his father's house a certain one-sided and, so to speak, bourgeois tendency, that is, a sober, homely sense for the practically useful, which would not allow itself to be dazzled by splendor and magnificence. Accordingly, he passed by with tolerable indifference the much admired works of art with which the city was at that time filled. For the ideal efforts of the Periclean age he lacked comprehension. Nor do the tragedies of a Sophocles appear to have exercised much attraction upon him. If there was one-sidedness in this, on the other hand, it bore good fruit, in so far as it confirmed the independence of his judgment, and enabled him to recognize and combat the defects and diseases from which Athens suffered even in the midst of her glories. But although the son of Sophroniscus carried the idea of the practically useful into the domain of science, he gave to it in this so deep and grand a significance that for him it again became an impulse towards searching with unflagging zeal for all real means of culture offered by Athens, for he felt the impossibility of satisfactorily responding to the moral tasks which most immediately await men, without the possession of a connected knowledge. Thus he eagerly associated with men and women esteemed as highly cultured. He listened to the lectures of the sophists, acquainted himself with the writings of the earlier philosophers, which he found to be still of vital effect upon his contemporaries, thoroughly studied with friends desirous of self-improvement the works of Heraclitus and Anaxagoras, and in this constant intercourse he gradually became himself another man, that is, he grew conscious of the unsatisfactory standpoint of the wisdom of the teachers of the day, as well as conscious of his own aims and mission. For, in putting questions of a kind which could meet with no reply, and in searching for deeper things than could be offered to him by his hearers, he gradually became himself the person from whom the impulse proceeded, and from whom in the end was expected an answer to the questions which had remained unsolved. He, the seeker after instruction, became the center of a circle of younger men who were enthusiastically attached to him. In how high a degree that which he endeavored to supply corresponded to the deeply felt needs of the age is evident from the fact that men of the most utterly different dispositions and stations in life gave themselves up to him. Youths of the highest class of society, full of self-consciousness, buoyancy, and reckless high spirits, such as Alcibiades, and again men of a melancholy and timid turn of mind, such as the well-known eccentric Apollodorus of Phalaris, who, perpetually discontented with himself and others, led a miserable existence until in Socrates he found the sole individuality appeasing his wants, and in intercourse with him the satisfaction for which he had longed. To him, Socrates was all in all, and every hour during which he was away from Socrates he accounted as lost. Thus, Socrates was able to reawaken among the Athenians, among whom personal intercourse between those of the same age, as well as between men and youths, was disturbed or desecrated, either by party interests or by impure sensuality, the beneficent power of pure friendship and unselfish devotion. Sober and calm himself, he excited the noblest enthusiasm, and by the simplest means obtained a far-reaching influence, such as before him no man had possessed at Athens, even before the Peace of Nicias, when Aristophanes made him the principal character in his Clouds. He was one of the best known and most influential personages at Athens. As Socrates gradually became a teacher of the people, so his mode and habits of life, too, formed themselves in indissoluble connection with his philosophical development. For this was the most preeminent among his qualities, that his life and his teachings were formed in the same mold, and that none of his disciples could say whether he had been more deeply affected by the words or by the example of his master. And this was connected with the fact that from the first his philosophy directed itself to that which might make men better and more pleasing to heaven, freer and happier at once. To this tendency he could not devote himself without rising in his own consciousness to a continuously loftier clearness and purity, and without subjecting to reason the elements inborn in him of sensual impulses, of inertia and passion. Thus he became a man in whom the world found much to smile and mock at, but whom even those who could not stomach his wisdom were obliged to acknowledge as a morally blameless and just citizen. He was devoted with absolute loyalty to his native city, and without desiring offices and dignities, he was, from an inner impulse, indefatigably active for her good. For the rest, Socrates, with all his dislike of the pursuit of profit and pleasure, was anything but a morose eccentric like Euripides. From this he was kept by his love of humankind. He was merry with the merry, and spoiled no festive banquet to which he had been bidden. In the friendly circle he sat as a man brave at his cups, and herein likewise offered an example to his friends how the truly free can at one time suffer deprivation, and at another enjoy abundance, without at any time losing his full self-control. After a night of festivity, his consciousness was as clear and serene as ever. He had, after a rare fashion, made his body an ever-ready servant of his mind. Even physically he could do things impossible to others, and, as if protected by some magic charm, he passed unhurt through all the pestilences of Athens, without ever timidly keeping out of the way of danger. Fully assured of the inner mission which animated him, he allowed nothing to derange or to confound him. Hostile attacks and derision touched him not. Nay, he was known to laugh most heartily of all the spectators when that sinner Aristophanes exhibited him as a dreamer, abstracted from the world and hanging in a hammock between heaven and earth, and when the other comic poets made the public merry with his personal appearance. For the same reason, lastly, he was inaccessible to all the offers made to him by foreign princes, who would have given much to attract the most remarkable men of the age to their courts. The Thessalian grandees in particular, Scopas and Crannon, and Eurylochus at Larissa, emulated one another in their endeavors to secure him. But he was no more tempted by their gold than by that of Archelaus, the splendor of whose throne, obtained by guile and murder, failed to dazzle Socrates. He replied, with the pride of a genuine republican, that it ill befitted any man to accept benefits which he had no power of returning. End of section 35.
Section 36. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. Section 36. Cuvier, 1769 to 1832, by Spencer Trotter. Modern zoological science is indebted in a large measure to the mind and labor of the three French savants, Lamarck, Saint-Hilaire, and Cuvier. Throughout the troubled times of the French Revolution, these three friends and co-laborers pursued their studies, arranging and interpreting the facts which they accumulated, and enriching the literature of the science to which they devoted their lives. Of the three, Cuvier stands forth with greatest prominence today as the one who by his studies in the structure and classification of animals, and through his reconstruction of the fossil animals of the Paris basin, has left the most enduring mark upon the literature of the subject. Georges Leopold Christian Frédéric Dagobert Cuvier was born at Montbéliard in Alsace on the 23rd of August, 1769. His mother devoted herself to the careful training and development of his growing mind, and in very early life he gave evidence of extraordinary intellectual endowment. Naturally industrious, and possessed of a remarkable memory and the power of concentration, young Cuvier, by the age of 14, had mastered the rudiments of several languages, both ancient and modern, had acquired a considerable knowledge of mathematics, had read widely in history, and was proficient in drawing. He very early showed a decided bent toward scientific pursuits, and drew his first inspiration from the works of Buffon, who was then at the zenith of his fame. While at school, he formed a society among his fellows for the reading and discussion of various subjects of a scientific and literary nature. Cuvier's talents became known to Prince Charles, the reigning Duke of Württemberg, who gave him a free education in the University of Stuttgart. After completing his university course with honor, he sought for a public office under the government of Prince Charles, but his parents' circumstances, his father being a retired officer of a Swiss regiment in the service of France, forced him to abandon this idea, and at the age of 19 he accepted the position of a tutor in the family of a nobleman who resided at Caen in Normandy. This proved to be the determining event in Cuvier's life. He found in the mollusk fauna of the nearby seacoast a fascinating subject for study, and devoted all of his spare time to the investigation of the structure and relations of the various forms that came to his notice. The Abbé Tessier, a member of the Academy of Sciences, who had fled to Normandy from Paris during the Reign of Terror, made the acquaintance of the young naturalist, and introduced him by correspondence to a number of the most eminent scientific men of Paris. One of these men was Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, and through his influence Cuvier was invited to assist Mertrude, the professor of comparative anatomy in the Museum of Natural History at the Jardin des Plantes. From this time on he threw all the energies of his remarkable mind into the study of animals and the building up of the museum. The collections which he originated rank among the finest in the world. In 1802 Cuvier was appointed one of 6 inspector generals to organize lyceums in a number of the French towns, and ever after gave a great part of his time and thought to the subject of education. The influence of his work in this direction is felt today in every institution of public instruction throughout France. On the annexation of Italy, he made 3 different visits to that country in order to reorganize the old academies, and although a Protestant, he was entrusted with the organization of the university at Rome. In a similar manner, he remodeled the educational systems throughout Holland and Belgium, and his reports on these questions are teeming with interest. Cuvier felt that the strength of a nation lay in the sound education of all classes, the lower as well as the upper, and to his enlightened views may be traced much of the excellent system of primary education that prevails in these countries today. Under the bigoted Bourbon government, the despotic rule of Napoleon, and the liberal reign of Louis Philippe, Cuvier maintained his post, and throughout the events of the 100 Days of 1815 he still held a high position in the Imperial University, of which he had been made a life member of the council at its foundation in 1808. He held a distinctive place as a member of the Council of State, as Minister of the Interior, as Chancellor of the University, and member of the Protestant Faculty of Theology. Louis Philippe conferred on him the title of Baron. He lived at the Jardin des Plantes, surrounded by his family and friends, and his home was the center of men of science from all parts of the world. On the 8th of May, 1832, after delivering an unusually eloquent introductory lecture at the College of France, he was stricken with paralysis, and though he rallied sufficiently to preside the next day at the Council of State, he died on the following Sunday. The chief value of Cuvier's work in general literature lies in the philosophical deductions which he drew from his studies. Lamarck had advanced the theory of the origin of species as a result of the action of the natural conditions of existence impressing and molding the plastic organism. Saint-Hilaire had advanced the doctrine of homology, i.e., the same structure appearing in a different form in different animals as a result of a difference of function. Cuvier opposed both of these theories, holding that each animal was a separate and distinct result of a special creative act, and that each part of its organization was expressly created to meet certain wants. Though the point of view of these three friends differed, yet each held the germ of truth. The action of the environment and the doctrine of homology are vital questions today, and Cuvier's deductions are equally pregnant with the truth, only their author viewed the facts as special creative acts of the divine intelligence. Probably the most wide-reaching effects of Cuvier's work came from his study and restoration of the fossil animals of the Paris basin, and the consequent recognition of the Tertiary as a distinct geological age. From his investigations in comparative anatomy, he proved that the parts of an animal agree so exactly that from seeing one fragment the whole can be known. This recognition of the correlation of parts was one of the grandest achievements of his master mind. Cuvier's scientific publications were numerous. His best known works are Le Règne Animal, The Animal Kingdom, published in 4 octavo volumes in 1817, and Recherches sur les ossements fossiles, Inquiry concerning fossil bones. This latter work is probably the most enduring monument to his fame, as it laid the basis of the present science of paleontology. The first volume of this work is a masterpiece of scientific literature, and has been widely translated. The English translation by Professor Jameson of Edinburgh, entitled Essay on the Theory of the Earth, has passed through several editions. Selection of Changes in the Structure of the Earth from The Theory of the Earth by Cuvier. The lowest and most level parts of the earth, when penetrated to a very great depth, exhibit nothing but horizontal strata composed of various substances, and containing almost all of them innumerable marine productions. Similar strata with the same kind of productions compose the hills even to a great height. Sometimes the shells are so numerous as to constitute the entire body of the stratum. They are almost everywhere in such a perfect state of preservation that even the smallest of them retain their most delicate parts, their sharpest ridges, and their finest and tenderest processes. They are found in elevations far above the level of every part of the ocean, and in places to which the sea could not be conveyed by any existing cause. They are not only enclosed in loose sand, but are often encrusted and penetrated on all sides by the hardest stones. Every part of the earth, every hemisphere, every continent, every island of any size exhibits the same phenomenon. We are therefore forcibly led to believe not only that the sea has at one period or another covered all our plains, but that it must have remained there for a long time, and in a state of tranquillity, which circumstance was necessary for the formation of deposits so extensive, so thick, in part so solid, and containing exuviae so perfectly preserved. The time is past for ignorance to assert that these remains of organized bodies are mere lusus naturae, productions generated in the womb of the earth by its own creative powers. A nice and scrupulous comparison of their forms, of their contexture, and frequently even of their composition, cannot detect the slightest difference between these shells and the shells which still inhabit the sea. They have therefore once lived in the sea, and been deposited by it. The sea consequently must have rested in the places where the deposition has taken place. Hence it is evident the basin or reservoir containing the sea has undergone some change at least, either in extent or in situation, or in both. Such is the result of the very first search and of the most superficial examination. The traces of revolutions become still more apparent and decisive when we ascend a little higher, and approach nearer to the foot of the great chains of mountains. There are still found many beds of shells; some of these are even larger and more solid. The shells are quite as numerous and as entirely preserved, but they are not of the same species with those which were found in the less elevated regions. The strata which contain them are not so generally horizontal. They have various degrees of inclination, and are sometimes situated vertically. While in the plains and low hills it was necessary to dig deep in order to detect the succession of the strata. Here we perceive them by means of the valleys which time or violence has produced, and which disclose their edges to the eye of the observer. At the bottom of these declivities huge masses of their débris are collected, and form round hills, the height of which is augmented by the operation of every thaw and of every storm. These inclined or vertical strata, which form the ridges of the secondary mountains, do not rest on the horizontal strata of the hills, which are situated at their base and serve as their first steps, but on the contrary are situated underneath them. The latter are placed upon the declivities of the former. When we dig through the horizontal strata in the neighborhood of the inclined strata, the inclined strata are invariably found below. Nay, sometimes, when the inclined strata are not too much elevated, their strata is surmounted by horizontal strata. The inclined strata are therefore more ancient than the horizontal strata, and as they must necessarily have been formed in a horizontal position, they have been subsequently shifted into their inclined or vertical position, and that too before the horizontal strata were placed above them. Thus the sea, previous to the formation of the horizontal strata, had formed others which by some means have been broken, lifted up, and overturned in 1,000 ways. There had therefore been also at least one change in the basin of that sea which preceded ours. It had also experienced at least one revolution; and as several of these inclined strata, which it had formed first, are elevated above the level of the horizontal strata which have succeeded and which surround them, this revolution, while it gave them their present inclination, had also caused them to project above the level of the sea, so as to form islands, or at least rocks and inequalities. And this must have happened whether one of their edges was lifted up above the water, or the depression of the opposite edge caused the water to subside. This is the second result, not less obvious nor less clearly demonstrated than the first, to every one who will take the trouble of studying carefully the remains by which it is illustrated and proved. If we institute a more detailed comparison between the various strata and those remains of animals which they contain, we shall soon discover still more numerous differences among them, indicating a proportional number of changes in their condition. The sea has not always deposited stony substances of the same kind. It has observed a regular succession as to the nature of its deposits. The more ancient the strata are, so much the more uniform and extensive are they; and the more recent they are, the more limited are they, and the more variation is observed in them at small distances. Thus the great catastrophes which have produced revolutions in the basin of the sea were preceded, accompanied, and followed by changes in the nature of the fluid and of the substances which it held in solution. And when the surface of the seas came to be divided by islands and projecting ridges, different changes took place in every separate basin. Amidst these changes of the general fluid, it must have been almost impossible for the same kind of animals to continue to live, nor did they do so in fact. Their species and even their genera change with the strata, and though the same species occasionally recur at small distances, it is generally the case that the shells of the ancient strata have forms peculiar to themselves, that they gradually disappear, till they are not to be seen at all in the recent strata, still less in the existing seas, in which indeed we never discover their corresponding species, and where several, even of their genera, are not to be found; that on the contrary the shells of the recent strata resemble, at respects, the genus, those which still exist in the sea; and that in the last formed and loosest of these strata there are some species which the eye of the most expert naturalist cannot distinguish from those which at present inhabit the ocean. In animal nature, therefore, there has been a succession of changes corresponding to those which have taken place in the chemical nature of the fluid. And when the sea last receded from our continent, its inhabitants were not very different from those which it still continues to support. Finally, if we examine with greater care these remains of organized bodies, we shall discover, in the midst even of the most ancient secondary strata, other strata that are crowded with animal or vegetable productions, which belong to the land and to fresh water. And amongst the most recent strata, that is, the strata which are nearest the surface, there are some of them in which land animals are buried under heaps of marine productions. Thus the various catastrophes of our planet have not only caused the different parts of our continent to rise by degrees from the basin of the sea, but it has also frequently happened that lands which had been laid dry have been again covered by the water, in consequence either of these lands sinking down below the level of the sea, or of the sea being raised above the level of the lands. The particular portions of the earth also, which the sea has abandoned by its last retreat, had been laid dry once before, and had at that time produced quadrupeds, birds, plants, and all kinds of terrestrial productions. It had then been inundated by the sea, which has since retired from it, and left it to be occupied by its own proper inhabitants. The changes which have taken place in the productions of the shelly strata, therefore, have not been entirely owing to a gradual and general retreat of the waters, but to successive eruptions and retreats, the final result of which, however, has been an universal depression of the level of the sea. These repeated eruptions and retreats of the sea have been neither slow nor gradual. Most of the catastrophes which have occasioned them have been sudden, and this is easily proved, especially with regard to the last of them, the traces of which are most conspicuous. In the northern regions it has left the carcasses of some large quadrupeds which the ice had arrested, and which are preserved even to the present day with their skin, their hair, and their flesh. If they had not been frozen as soon as killed, they must quickly have been decomposed by putrefaction; but this eternal frost could not have taken possession of the regions which these animals inhabited, except by the same cause which destroyed them. This cause therefore must have been as sudden as its effect. The breaking to pieces and overturnings of the strata, which happened in former catastrophes, show plainly enough that they were sudden and violent like the last; and the heaps of débris and rounded pebbles which are found in various places among the solid strata demonstrate the vast force of the motions excited in the mass of waters by these overturnings. Life, therefore, has been often disturbed on this earth by terrible events, calamities which, at their commencement, have perhaps moved and overturned to a great depth the entire outer crust of the globe, but which, since these first commotions, have uniformly acted at a less depth and less generally. Numberless living beings have been the victims of these catastrophes. Some have been destroyed by sudden inundations; others have been laid dry in consequence of the bottom of the seas being instantaneously elevated. Their races even have become extinct, and have left no memorial of them, except some small fragment which the naturalist can scarcely recognize. Such are the conclusions which necessarily result from the objects that we meet with at every step of our inquiry, and which we can always verify by examples drawn from almost every country. Every part of the globe bears the impress of these great and terrible events so distinctly that they must be visible to all who are qualified to read their history in the remains which they have left behind. But what is still more astonishing and not less certain, there have not been always living creatures on the earth, and it is easy for the observer to discover the period at which animal productions began to be deposited. As we ascend to higher points of elevation and advance towards the lofty summits of the mountains, the remains of marine animals, that multitude of shells we have spoken of, begin very soon to grow rare, and at length disappear altogether. We arrive at strata of a different nature, which contain no vestige at all of living creatures. Nevertheless, their crystallization and even the nature of their strata show that they also have been formed in a fluid. Their inclined position and their slopes show that they also have been moved and overturned. The oblique manner in which they sink under the shelly strata shows that they have been formed before these; and the height to which their bare and rugged tops are elevated above all the shelly strata shows that their summits have never again been covered by the sea since they were raised up out of its bosom. Such are those primitive or primordial mountains which traverse our continents in various directions, rising above the clouds, separating the basins of the rivers from one another, serving by means of their eternal snows as reservoirs for feeding the springs, and forming in some measure the skeleton, or as it were the rough framework of the earth. The sharp peaks and rugged indentations which mark their summits and strike the eye at a great distance are so many proofs of the violent manner in which they have been elevated. Their appearance in this respect is very different from that of the rounded mountains and the hills with flat surfaces, whose recently formed masses have always remained in the situation in which they were quietly deposited by the sea which last covered them. These proofs become more obvious as we approach. The valleys have no longer those gently sloping sides, or those alternately salient and re-entrant angles opposite to one another, which seem to indicate the beds of ancient streams. They widen and contract without any general rule. Their waters sometimes expand into lakes, and sometimes descend in torrents; and here and there the rocks, suddenly approaching from each side, form traverse dikes over which the waters fall in cataracts. The shattered strata of these valleys expose their edges on one side, and present on the other side large portions of their surface lying obliquely. They do not correspond in height, but those which on one side form the summit of the declivity often dip so deep on the other as to be altogether concealed. Yet amidst all this confusion some naturalists have thought that they perceived a certain degree of order prevailing, and that among these immense beds of rocks, broken and overturned though they be, a regular succession is observed, which is nearly the same in all the different chains of mountains. According to them, the granite, which surmounts every other rock, also dips under every other rock, and is the most ancient of any that has yet been discovered in the place assigned it by nature. The central ridges of most of the mountain chains are composed of it. Slaty rocks, such as clay slate, granular quartz, grès, and mica slate, rest upon its sides and form lateral chains. Granular, foliated limestone or marble, and other calcareous rocks that do not contain shells, rest upon the slate, forming the exterior ranges, and are the last formations by which this ancient, uninhabited sea seems to have prepared itself for the production of its bed of shells. On all occasions, even in districts that lie at a distance from the great mountain chains, where the more recent strata have been digged through and the external covering of the earth penetrated to a considerable depth, nearly the same order of stratification has been found as that already described. The crystallized marbles never cover the shelly strata. The granite in mass never rests upon the crystallized marble, except in a few places where it seems to have been formed of granites of newer epochs. In one word, the foregoing arrangement appears to be general, and must therefore depend upon general causes, which have on all occasions exerted the same influence from one extremity of the earth to the other. Hence it is impossible to deny that the waters of the sea have formerly and for a long time covered those masses of matter which now constitute our highest mountains; and farther, that these waters during a long time did not support any living bodies. Thus it has not been only since the commencement of animal life that these numerous changes and revolutions have taken place in the constitution of the external covering of our globe. For the masses formed previous to that event have suffered changes, as well as those which have been formed since. They have also suffered violent changes in their positions, and a part of these assuredly took place while they existed alone, and before they were covered over by the shelly masses. The proof of this lies in the overturnings, the disruptions, and the fissures which are observable in their strata, as well as in those of more recent formation, which are there even in greater number and better defined. But these primitive masses have also suffered other revolutions posterior to the formation of the secondary strata, and have perhaps given rise to, or at least have partaken of, some portion of the revolutions and changes which these latter strata have experienced. There are actually considerable portions of the primitive strata uncovered, although placed in lower situations than many of the secondary strata. And we cannot conceive how it should have so happened, unless the primitive strata in these places had forced themselves into view after the formation of those which are secondary. In some countries we find numerous and prodigiously large blocks of primitive substances scattered over the surface of the secondary strata, and separated by deep valleys from the peaks or ridges whence these blocks must have been derived. It is necessary, therefore, either that these blocks must have been thrown into those situations by means of eruptions, or that the valleys, which otherwise must have stopped their course, did not exist at the time of their being transported to their present sites. Thus we have a collection of facts, a series of epochs anterior to the present time, and of which the successive steps may be ascertained with perfect certainty, although the periods which intervened cannot be determined with any degree of precision. These epochs form so many fixed points, answering as rules for directing our inquiries respecting this ancient chronology of the earth. Of the fabulous animals of the ancient writers. Perhaps some persons may be disposed to employ an opposite train of argument, and to allege that the ancients were not only acquainted with as many large quadrupeds as we are, as has been already shown, but that they actually described several others which we do not now know; that we are rash in considering the accounts of all such animals as fabulous; that we ought to search for them with the utmost care before concluding that we have acquired a complete knowledge of the existing animal creation; and, in fine, that among those animals which we presume to be fabulous, we may perhaps discover, when better acquainted with them, the actual originals of the bones of those species which are now unknown. Perhaps some may even conceive that the various monsters, essential ornaments of the history of the heroic ages of almost every nation, are precisely those very species which it was necessary to destroy in order to allow the establishment of civilized societies. Thus Theseus and Bellerophon must have been more fortunate than all the nations of more modern days, who have only been able to drive back the noxious animals into the deserts and ill-peopled regions, but have never yet succeeded in exterminating a single species. It is easy to reply to the foregoing objections by examining the descriptions that are left us by the ancients of those unknown animals, and by inquiring into their origins. Now the greater number of those animals have an origin purely mythological, and of this origin the descriptions given of them bear the most unequivocal marks. As in almost all of them, we see merely the different parts of known animals united by an unbridled imagination, and in contradiction to every established law of nature. Those which have been invented by the poetical fancy of the Greeks have at least some grace and elegance in their composition, resembling the fantastic decorations which are still observable on the ruins of some ancient buildings, and which have been multiplied by the fertile genius of Raphael in his paintings. Like these, they unite forms which please the eye by agreeable contours and fanciful combinations, but which are utterly repugnant to nature and reason, being merely the productions of inventive and playful genius, or perhaps meant as emblematical representations of metaphysical or moral propositions, veiled under mystical hieroglyphics after the Oriental manner. Learned men may be permitted to employ their time and ingenuity in attempts to decipher the mystic knowledge concealed under the forms of the Sphinx of Thebes, the Pegasus of Thessaly, the Minotaur of Crete, or the Chimera of Epirus, but it would be folly to expect seriously to find such monsters in nature. We might as well endeavor to find the animals of Daniel, or the beasts of the Apocalypse, in some hitherto unexplored recesses of the globe. Neither can we look for the mythological animals of the Persians, creatures of a still bolder imagination, such as the Martichor, or destroyer of men, having a human head on the body of a lion and the tail of a scorpion; the Griffin, or guardian of hidden treasures, half eagle and half lion; or the Cartazonon, or wild ass, armed with a long horn on its forehead. Ctesias, who reports these as actual living animals, has been looked upon by some authors as an inventor of fables, whereas he only attributes real existence to hieroglyphical representations. These strange compositions of fancy have been seen in modern times on the ruins of Persepolis. It is probable that their hidden meanings may never be ascertained, but at all events we are quite certain that they were never intended to be representations of real animals. Agatharcides, another fabricator of animals, drew his information in all probability from a similar source. The ancient monuments of Egypt still furnish us with numerous fantastic representations in which the parts of different kinds of creatures are strangely combined. Men with the heads of animals, and animals with the heads of men, which have given rise to cynocephaly, satyrs, and sphinxes. The custom of exhibiting in the same sculpture in bas relief men of very different heights, of making kings and conquerors gigantic, while their subjects and vassals are represented as only a fourth or fifth part of their size, must have given rise to the fable of the pygmies. In some corner of these monuments Agatharcides must have discovered his carnivorous bull, whose mouth, extending from ear to ear, devoured every other animal that came in his way. But scarcely any naturalist will acknowledge the existence of any such animal, since nature has never joined cloven hoofs and horns with teeth adapted for cutting and devouring animal food. There may have been other figures equally strange with these, either among those monuments of Egypt which have not been able to resist the ravages of time, or in the ancient temples of Ethiopia and Arabia, which have been destroyed by the religious zeal of the Abyssinians and Mahometans. The monuments of India teem with such figures, but the combinations in these are so ridiculously extravagant that they have never imposed even upon the most credulous. Monsters with 100 arms and 20 heads of different kinds are far too absurd to be believed. Nay, the inhabitants of China and Japan have their imaginary animals, which they represent as real, and that too in their religious books. The Mexicans had them. In short, they are to be found among every people whose idolatry has not yet acquired some degree of refinement. But is there any one who could possibly pretend to discover, amidst the realities of animal nature, what are thus so plainly the productions of ignorance and superstition? And yet some travelers, influenced by a desire to make themselves famous, have gone so far as to pretend that they saw these fancied beings; or, deceived by a slight resemblance into which they were too careless to inquire, they have identified these with creatures that actually exist. In their eyes, large baboons or monkeys have become cynocephaly, and sphinxes real men with long tails. It is thus that St. Augustine imagined he had seen a satyr. Real animals, observed and described with equal inaccuracy, may have given rise to some of these ideal monsters. Thus we can have no doubt of the existence of the hyena, though the back of this animal is not supported by a single bone, and though it does not change its sex yearly, as alleged by Pliny. Perhaps the carnivorous bull may only have been the two-horned rhinoceros falsely described. M. de Weltheim considers the auriferous ants of Herodotus as the Corsacks of modern naturalists. The most famous among these fabulous animals of the ancients was the unicorn. Its real existence has been obstinately asserted even in the present day, or at least proofs of its existence have been eagerly sought for. 3 several animals are frequently mentioned by the ancients as having only one horn placed on the middle of the forehead: the oryx of Africa having cloven hoofs, the hair placed reversely to that of other animals, its height equal to that of the bull or even of the rhinoceros, and said to resemble deer and goats in its form; the Indian ass having solid hoofs; and the monoceros, properly so called, whose feet are sometimes compared to those of the lion and sometimes to those of the elephant, and is therefore considered as having divided feet. The horse unicorn and the bull unicorn are doubtless both referable to the Indian ass, for even the latter is described as having solid hoofs. We may therefore be fully assured that these animals have never really existed, as no solitary horns have ever found their way into our collections, excepting those of the rhinoceros and narwhal. After careful consideration, it is impossible that we should give any credit to rude sketches made by savages upon rocks. Entirely ignorant of perspective, and wishing to represent the outlines of a straight-horned antelope in profile, they could only give the figure one horn, and thus they produced an oryx. The oryxes that are seen on the Egyptian monuments likewise are probably nothing more than productions of the stiff style imposed on the sculptors of the country by religious prejudices. Several of their profiles of quadrupeds show only one fore and one hinder leg, and it is probable that the same rule led them also to represent only one horn. Perhaps their figures may have been copied after individuals that had lost one of their horns by accident, a circumstance that often happens to the chamois and the sega, species of the antelope genus, and this would be quite sufficient to establish the error. All the ancients, however, have not represented the oryx as having only one horn. Oppian expressly attributes two to this animal, and Aelian mentions one that had four. Finally, if this animal was ruminant and cloven-footed, we are quite certain that its frontal bone must have been divided longitudinally into two, and that it could not possibly, as it is very justly remarked by Camper, have had a horn placed upon the suture. It may be asked, however, what two-horned animals could have given an idea of the oryx in the forms in which it has been transmitted down to us, even independent of the notion of a single horn. To this I answer, as already done by Pallas, that it was the straight-horned antelope oryx of Gmelin, improperly named Paysan by Buffon. This animal inhabits the deserts of Africa, and must frequently approach the confines of Egypt, and appears to be that which is represented in the hieroglyphics. It equals the ox in height, while the shape of its body approaches to that of a stag, and its straight horns present exceedingly formidable weapons, hard almost as iron, and sharp-pointed like javelins. Its hair is whitish, it has black spots and streaks on its face, and the hair on its back points forward. Such is the description given by naturalists, and the fables of the Egyptian priests, which have occasioned the insertion of its figure among their hieroglyphics, do not require to have been founded in nature. Supposing that an individual of this species may have been seen which had lost one of its horns by some accident, it may have been taken as a representative of the entire race, and erroneously adopted by Aristotle to be copied by all his successors. All this is quite possible and even natural, and gives not the smallest evidence for the existence of a single-horned species of antelope. In regard to the Indian ass, of the alexipharmic virtues of whose horn the ancients speak, we find the Eastern nations of the present day attributing exactly the same property of counteracting poison to the horn of the rhinoceros. When this horn was first imported into Greece, nothing probably was known respecting the animal to which it belonged, and accordingly it was not known to Aristotle. Agatharcides is the first author by whom it is mentioned. In the same manner, ivory was known to the ancients long before the animal from which it is procured, and perhaps some of their travelers may have given to the rhinoceros the name of Indian ass, with as much propriety as the Romans denominated the elephant the bull of Lucania. Everything which they relate of the strength, size, and ferocity of their wild ass of India corresponds sufficiently with the rhinoceros. In succeeding times, when the rhinoceros came to be better known to naturalists, finding that former authors mentioned a single-horned animal under the name of Indian ass, they concluded without any examination that it must be quite a distinct creature having solid hoofs. We have remaining a detailed description of the Indian ass written by Ctesias. But as we have already seen that this must have been taken from the ruins of Persepolis, it should go for nothing in the real history of the animal. When there afterwards appeared more exact descriptions of an animal having several toes or hoofs on each foot, the ancients conceived it to be a third species of one-horned animals, to which they gave the name of monoceros. These double and even triple references are most frequent among ancient writers, because most of their works which have come down to us were mere compilations, because even Aristotle himself has often mixed borrowed facts with those which had come under his own observation, and because the habit of critically investigating the authorities of previous writers was as little known among ancient naturalists as among their historians. From all these reasonings and digressions, it may be fairly concluded that the large animals of the ancient continent with which we are now acquainted were known to the ancients, and that all the animals of which the ancients have left descriptions, and which are now unknown, were merely fabulous. It also follows that the large animals of the three anciently known quarters of the world were very soon known to the people who frequented their coasts. It may also be concluded that no large species remains to be discovered in America, as there is no good reason that can be assigned why any such should exist in that country with which we are unacquainted. And in fact, none has been discovered there during the last 150 years. From all these considerations, it may be safely concluded, as shall be more minutely explained in the sequel, that none of the large species of quadrupeds, whose remains are now found embedded in regular rocky strata, are at all similar to any of the known living species; that this circumstance is by no means the mere effect of chance, or because the species to which these fossil bones have belonged are still concealed in the desert and uninhabited parts of the world, and have hitherto escaped the observation of travelers; but that this astonishing phenomenon has proceeded from general causes, and that the careful investigation of it affords one of the best means for discovering and explaining the nature of these causes. End of section 36.
Section 37 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in January 2020. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. Section 37. Selected Works by Felix Dahn. Felix Dahn was born at Hamburg, February 9, 1834, but when he was only 6 weeks old, the family removed to Munich. His parents, Friedrich and Constanze Dahn, were celebrated actors and members of the Royal Theatre at Munich. His childhood, youth, and early manhood were passed in Munich, with the exception of 1 year, 1852-3, spent at the University of Berlin. A somewhat lonely but not unhappy childhood in the fine old house in the Königinstrasse, with its surroundings of parks and pleasant gardens, developed his dreamy, poetic instincts. His first poem, written at the age of 14, is the spontaneous lyric outburst of a boy's joy in nature. Dahn was educated at the Latin School and the University of Munich. He was but a lad when Homer opened to him a new world. He began to read the Iliad, and scarcely left off night or day until it was finished. The Odyssey followed in the same way, and in 2 months he had read them both and begun again at the beginning. Poetry had rendered his mind susceptible to learning, and he read, in school and out, every classic that fell into his hands. History as well as poetry early became a passion to him, and the uniformity of his intellectual development made every province of learning his own. The Teutonic languages, Old and New, Anglo-Saxon, Gothic, Norse, etc., as well as Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, and English, were easily assimilated. At the university, both at Munich and Berlin, he devoted himself to history, philosophy, and jurisprudence. In 1857 he became docent in the Faculty of Law at the University of Munich, and in 1862 was made professor. In the following year he was appointed professor of German law and jurisprudence at Würzburg, and in 1872 he was called to Königsberg to the same chair, and in 1888 to Breslau. He took part in the war of 1870–71 and was present at the Battle of Sedan. Dahn is distinguished as a historian, novelist, poet, and dramatist. His principal historical works are Die Könige der Germanen, The Kings of the Germans, 1861–72, 6 volumes, Urgeschichte der germanischen und romanischen Völker, Primitive History of the Germanic and Romance Peoples, 1878. These two rank high among the contributions to German history and ethnology in the 19th century. Among his most prominent works in law is Die Vernunft im Recht, Reason in Law, 1879. As a poet and dramatist, several of his performances have attained eminence. In 1857 he published his first collection of poems, and a second collection followed in 1873. 12 Balladen, 12 ballads, appeared in 1875, and Balladen und Lieder, ballads and songs, in 1878. By far his greatest romance is Der Kampf um Rom, The Struggle for Rome, 1876, a work of preeminent power and merit. It is a voluminous study, a series of elaborate pictures dealing with the empires of the East and the West in the 6th century. Its scenes are chiefly laid in Ravenna, at the time of that city's great splendor under the Gothic sovereignty, and at Rome. The fierce and beautiful Amalasuinta, also called often Amalasuonta, is a prominent character, and other vivid types are Cassiodorus, Totila, and Matasuinta. Following this novel, among others, appeared in 1878 Kämpfende Herzen, Struggling Hearts, in 1880 Odins Trost, Odin's Consolation, and in 1882–90 a series of historical novels under the common title Kleine Romane aus der Völkerwanderung, short novels from the wandering of the nations, from the first of which, Felicitas, an appended extract is taken. Among his dramas are Markgraf Rüdiger von Bechelaren, König Roderich, and Deutsche Treue, German Fidelity. The Young Wife, from Felicitas, copyrighted by George S. Gottsberger, 1883, reprinted by permission of George G. Peck. It was a beautiful June evening. The sun, setting in golden radiance, cast its glittering rays from the west, from Findelicia upon the hill of Mercury and the modest villa crowning it. Only a subdued murmur reached this spot from the highway, along which ever and anon a two-wheeled cart, drawn by Norican oxen, was moving homeward from the western gate of Juvavum, the Porta Vindelica, as were also the country people who had been selling vegetables, hens, and doves in the Forum of Hercules during the day just ended. So it was quiet and peaceful on the hill. Beyond the stone wall, which was lower than the height of a man, and which enclosed the garden, nothing was heard, save the rippling of the little rivulet, which, after leaving its marble basin at its source, fed the fountain, and then wound in graceful curves through the carefully kept garden, and finally near the entrance, which was surmounted by Hermes, but destitute of door or grating, passed under a gap in the wall, and flowed down the hill in a stone channel. At the foot of this hill, towards the southeast, in the direction of the city, lay carefully tilled vegetable gardens and orchards, luxuriant green meadows, and fields of spelt, a grain brought by the Romans to the land of the barbarians. Behind the villa, on the ascending hillside, towered and rustled a beautiful grove of beeches, from whose depths echoed the metallic notes of the yellow thrush. The scene was so beautiful, so peaceful, only in the west and the southeast could a dark cloud be seen. From the open gateway a straight path, strewn with white sand, led through the spacious garden, and was bordered with lofty evergreen oaks and clumps of yew trees, the latter, according to a long prevailing fashion, clipped into all sorts of geometrical figures, a token of taste, or the lack of it, the Rococo age did not invent, but merely borrowed from the gardens of the emperors. Statues stood at regular distances along the way from the gate to the entrance of the dwelling, nymphs, a Flora, a Sylvanus, a Mercury, poor specimens of work executed in plaster. Fat Crispus manufactured them by the dozen in his workshop on the square of Vulcanus at Juvavum, and sold them cheap. Times were hard for men, and still worse for gods and demigods, but these were a free gift. Crispus was brother to the father of the young master of the house. From the garden gate sounded a few hammer strokes, echoed back from the stone wall of the enclosure. They were light taps, for they were cautiously guided by an artist's hand, apparently the last finishing touches of a master. The man who wielded the hammer now started up. He had been kneeling behind the gate, beside which, piled one above another, a dozen unhewn marble slabs announced the dwelling of a stone-cutter. Thrusting the little hammer into the belts that fastened the leather apron upon the blue tunic, he poured from a small flask a few drops of oil on a woolen cloth, and carefully rubbed the inscription upon the marble with it until it was as smooth as a mirror. Then, turning his head a little on one side, like a bird that wants to examine something closely, with an approving nod he read aloud the words on the slab. Hic habitat felicitas, nihil mali intret. Yes, yes, here dwells happiness, my happiness, our happiness, so long as my Felicitas lives here, happy herself and making others happy. May misfortune never cross this threshold. May every demon of ill be banished by this motto. The house has now received a beautiful finish in these words. But where is she? She must see it and praise me. Felicitas, he called, turning towards the house. Come here. Wiping the perspiration from his brow, he stood erect, a pliant, youthful figure of middle height, not unlike the Mercury in the garden, modelled by Crispus according to the ancient traditions of symmetry. Dark brown hair, cut short, curled closely, almost like a cap, over his uncovered round head. A pair of dark eyes, shaded by heavy brows, laughed merrily out into the world. His bare feet and arms were beautifully formed, but showed little strength. It was only in the right arm that the muscles stood forth prominently. The brown leather apron was white with scrapings from the marble. He shook off the dust and called again, in a louder tone, Felicitas! A white figure, framed like a picture between the two pilasters of the entrance, appeared on the threshold, pushing back the dark yellow curtain suspended from a bronze pole by movable rings. A very young girl, or was it a young wife? Yes, this child, scarcely 17, must have already become a wife, for she was undoubtedly the mother of the infant she pressed to her bosom with her left arm. No one but a mother holds a child with such an expression in face and attitude. The young wife pressed 2 fingers of her right hand, with the palm turned outward, warningly to her lips. "Hush," she said, "our child is asleep." And now the slender figure, not yet wholly matured, floated down the 4 stone steps leading from the threshold to the garden, carefully lifting the child a little higher and holding it still more closely with her left arm, while her right hand raised her snowy robe to the dainty ankle. The faultlessly beautiful oval head was slightly bent forward. It was a vision of perfect grace, even more youthful, more childlike than Raphael's Madonnas, and not humble, yet at the same time mystically transfigured, like the mother of the Christ child. There was nothing complicated, nothing miraculous, naught save the noblest simplicity blended with royal grandeur in Felicitas's unconscious innocence and dignity. The movements of this Hebe who had become a mother were as measured and graceful as a perfect musical harmony. A wife, yet still a maiden, purely human, perfectly happy, absorbed and satisfied by her love for her young husband and the child at her breast, so chaste in coloring was the perfect beauty of her form and face that every profane desire vanished in her presence as though she were a statue. She wore no ornaments. Her light brown hair, gleaming with a gold tinge where the sun kissed it, was drawn back in natural waves from the beautiful temples, revealing the low forehead, and was fastened in a loose knot at the nape of the neck. A milk-white robe of the finest wool, fastened on the left shoulder by an exquisitely shaped but plain silver clasp, fell in flowing folds around her figure, revealing the neck, the upper part of the swelling bosom, and the still childish arms which seemed a little too long, and reached to the ankles, just touching the dainty scarlet leather sandals. Beneath the breast, one end of the robe was drawn through a bronze girdle a hand's breadth wide. So she glided noiselessly as a wave down the steps and up to her husband. The narrow oval face possessed the marvelous, almost bluish, white tint peculiar to the daughters of Ionia, which no southern noonday sun can brown. The semicircular eyebrows, as regular as if marked by a pair of compasses, might have given the countenance a lifeless, almost statuesque expression, had not under the long, low-curling lashes the dark brown antelope eyes shone with the most vivid animation as she fixed them on her beloved husband. The latter rushed towards her with elastic steps. Carefully and tenderly taking the sleeping child from her arm, he laid it under the shade of a rose-bush in the oval shallow straw-lid of his work-basket. One full-blown rose waving in the evening breeze tossed fragrant petals on the little one, who smiled in sleep. The master of the house, throwing his arm around his young wife's almost too slender waist, led her to the slab just completed for the threshold of the entrance, saying, "The motto I have kept secret, which I have worked so hard to finish, is now done. Read it, and know, and feel," here he tenderly kissed her lips, "you yourself are the happiness. You dwell here." Translation of Mary J. Safford. The Vengeance of Gotheliндis. From The Struggle for Rome. The slave silently opened a door in the marble walls. Amalasuinta entered and stood in the narrow gallery which ran around the basin. Just in front, low steps led into the magnificent bath, from which already warm, delicious odors were rising. Light fell in from above through an octagonal dome of finely cut glass. At the entrance was a flight of steps of cedar wood, which led up 12 stairs to a springboard. Round about the marble walls of the gallery, as well as of the basin, countless friezes hid the mouths of the pipes needed for the waterworks and the hot air. Silently, the bathwoman spread the bathing accessories over the soft cushions and carpets that covered the floor of the gallery and turned toward the door. "Why is it that I feel that I know you?" asked the princess, looking at her thoughtfully. "How long have you been here?" "Since 8 days." And she took hold of the door. "How long have you served Cassiodorus?" "I have always served the Princess Gothelindis." With a cry of terror, Amalasuintha started up at this name. She turned and grasped at the garment of the woman. Too late. She was gone. The door fell to. Amalasuintha heard the key drawn out of the lock. In vain her eye sought for another place of exit. Then an immense unnameable fear overcame the queen. She felt that she had been terribly deceived, that there was hidden a disastrous secret. Fear, nameless fear, fell upon her. Flight, flight out of this chamber was her one thought. But flight seemed impossible. The door from this side was now only a thick marble slab, like those at the right and the left. Not even a pin could penetrate through the seams. In despair her eyes travelled around the wall of the gallery. Only the tritons and dolphins stared back at her. At last her gaze rested on the snake-enwreathed head of the Medusa just opposite, and she uttered a cry of terror. The face of the Medusa was pushed aside, and the oval space under the snaky hair was filled by a human countenance. Was it a human countenance? Trembling, she clutched the marble railing, and leaning far forward peered over. Yes, those were the features of Gothelindis, drawn to a grimace, and a hell of hatred and scorn flamed in her eyes. Amalasuintha sank on her knees and hid her face. You here!" Hoarse laughter answered her. "Yes, Amelung woman, I am here, and to your ruin. This island, this house, is mine. It shall be your grave. Dolius and all slaves of Cassiodorus are mine, sold to me a week ago. I have lured you hither. I have followed you as your shadow. Through long days and long nights I have borne within me burning hatred, at length to taste here full revenge. For hours I will enjoy your mortal agony, will witness miserable, moaning terror shake as in fever that proud body, and cover that haughty face. Oh, I will drink a sea of revenge." Amalasuintha rose, wringing her hands. "Revenge, Gothelindis? Wherefore? Whence this deadly hatred of me?" "Ha! And you ask? To be sure, decades have passed by, and the heart of the happy soon forgets. But hatred has a more faithful memory. Have you forgotten how once upon a time 2 young girls played beneath the plantains on the meadows of Ravenna? Both were chief among their playmates. Both were young, beautiful, and charming, the one daughter of a king, the other daughter of the Balta. And the girls had to choose a queen for their games, and they chose Gothelindis, for she was yet more beautiful than you, and not as imperious, and they chose her once, twice in succession. But the daughter of the king stood by, consumed by wild, untamable pride and envy. And when they chose me for the 3rd time, she took up the sharp-pointed garden scissors— Stop! Oh, hush, Gothelindis! And flung it at me. And it hit its mark, and crying out and bloody I fell to the ground, my whole cheek a gaping wound, and my eye pierced. Ah, how that hurts even now!" "Pardon, forgive me, Gothelindis," moaned the prisoner. "You had forgiven me long ago." "Forgiven? I forgive you? That you robbed my face of its eye and my life of its beauty? Shall I forgive that? You had got the better of me for life. Gothelindis was no longer dangerous. She mourned in silence. The disfigured one fled the eyes of men. And years passed. Then out of Spain came to the court of Ravenna the noble Eutharic, the Amelar with the dark eye and the tender heart. He, ill himself, took pity on the ill half-blind one, and he talked with her kindly and compassionately, with the ugly one whom all else avoided. Oh, how that refreshed my thirsting soul! And it was decided, in order to bury the old hatred between the two houses, to wipe away old and recent guilt, for the Duke of the Balta, Alaric, had likewise been executed on secret, unproved accusation, that the poor maltreated daughter of the Balta should become the wife of the noblest of the Amalar. When you heard that, you, who had disfigured me, you decided to take my lover from me, not from jealousy, not because you loved him, no, from pride, because you wanted as your own the chief man in the Gothic kingdom, the next male heir to the crown. You decided on that, and you achieved it. Your father could not deny you any wish, and Eutharic forgot at once his pity for the one-eyed one, as soon as the hand of the beautiful daughter of the king beckoned to him. For compensation, or was it for scorn, they gave to me likewise an Amelar, Theodahad, the miserable coward. Gothelindis, I swear to you I never imagined that you loved Eutharic. How could I— To be sure, how could you think that the ugly one would lift her thoughts so high? Oh, you cursed one! And if you had loved him and had made him happy, I would have forgiven you everything. But you did not love him, you can love only the sceptre. You made him miserable. For years I saw him at your side, bowed down, unloved, frozen to the marrow by your coldness. Sorrow because of your chilling pride soon killed him. You have robbed me of my lover and sent him to the grave. Revenge, revenge for him. And the deep vault re-echoed the cry, Revenge, revenge. Help, ho! cried Amalasuinta. She ran in despair along the circle of the gallery, beating her hands against the marble slab. Yes, cry out. No one hears you now but the god of vengeance. Do you think that for months I have curbed in my hatred in vain? How often, how easily could I even in Ravenna have reached you with poniard or poison? But no, I have lured you hither. At the petition of my cousins, at your bed an hour ago, I restrained my uplifted arm from the stroke. Yes, for you shall die slowly, inch by inch. For hours I will watch your mortal agony increase. Terrible one! Oh, what are hours, compared to the decades through which you have tortured me with my disfigurement, with your beauty, with the possession of my lover. What are hours compared to decades? But you shall pay for it. What will you do? Cried the tortured one, again and again looking for an escape along the walls. Do? I will drown you, slowly, slowly, in the waterworks of this bath which your friend Cassiodorus built. You do not know the pangs of jealousy and impotent fury I have suffered in this house, when you shared the couch with Eutharic, and I was among your followers and obliged to serve you. In this bath, you haughty one, I have loosened your sandals and dried the proud limbs. In this bath you shall die. Gothelindis pressed a button. The floor of the basin of the upper story, the circular metal plate, divided into two semicircles. They disappeared to the right and left in the wall. The prisoner in terror looked from the narrow gallery into the abysmal depth at her feet. "Remember my eye!" cried Gothelindis, and then of a sudden the sluices at the bottom opened and the waters of the lake rushed in, gurgling and foaming, and rose higher and higher with terrible swiftness. Amalasuentha saw certain death before her. She knew the impossibility of escaping, or of softening with prayers her devilish enemy. But her old proud Amelung courage returned. Composedly she awaited her fate. Near her, to the right of the entrance, she saw among the many friezes of Greek mythology a representation of the death of Christ. That refreshed her soul. She knelt down before the marble crucifix, clasped it with both hands, and prayed calmly with closed eyes, while the waters rose and rose. Now they dashed against the steps of the gallery. "You are going to pray, are you, murderess?" cried Gothelindis furiously. "Away from the crucifix! Remember the 3 dukes!" Of a sudden all the dolphins and tritons on the right side of the octagon began to spout streams of hot water. White smoke puffed out of the pipes. Amalasuentha sprang up and rushed to the other side of the gallery. "Gothelindis, I forgive you. Kill me, but do you likewise forgive my soul." And the water rose and rose. Already it surged over the upper step and pushed slowly onto the floor of the gallery. "I forgive you? Never. Think of Eutorek." And from the left the boiling streams of water hissed toward Amalasuentha. She now fled toward the center, just opposite the head of the Medusa, the only place where no stream from the pipes could reach her. If she mounted the springboard placed here, she could for a little yet prolong her life. Gothelindis seemed to expect this, in order to enjoy the prolonged agony. The water already foamed on the marble floor of the gallery, and moistened the feet of the prisoner. Quickly she bounded up the brown shimmering steps, and leaned against the railing of the bridge. "Hear me, Gothelindis, my last prayer, not for myself, for my people, for our people. Petros intends to despoil it and Theodahat. Yes, I know this realm is the uppermost care of your soul. Despair, it is lost. These foolish Goths, who for centuries preferred the Amalar to the Balta, are sold and betrayed by the house of the Amalar. Belisarius draws near, and there is none to warn them." "You are mistaken, fiend. They are warned. I, their queen, have warned them. Hail to my people, ruin to its enemies, and mercy to my soul." And with a quick leap she threw herself from the platform into the waters. Foaming, they closed over her. Gothelindis stared at the place where her victim had stood. "She has disappeared," she said. Then she looked down into the water. The kerchief of Amalasuentha was swimming on the surface. "Even in death this woman triumphs over me," she said slowly. "How long lasted the hatred, and how short was revenge?" Translated for A Library of the World's Best Literature by R.H. Knorr. End of section 37.
Section 38 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10, Section 38. Selected Works by Olaf von Dalin. Olaf von Dalin, 1708 to 1763, by William H. Carpenter. Olaf von Dalin, the father of modern Swedish poetry, was born at Vinberga in Halland, Sweden, August 29, 1708. He was one of the most important figures in Swedish literature during a transitional period, which in consequence of the influence he exercised has been called the Dalin Age. He was the son of a clergyman and studied at the University of Lund, where under the instruction of Ridelius he particularly devoted himself to French and English literature. At the age of 20 he went to Stockholm in the capacity of tutor, and in 1731 he entered the government service. His talents, brilliancy, and adaptability made him a universal favorite, and his career was singularly unobstructed. He was the embodiment of the vital new spirit which flashed upon the dullness of the time, breaking up formalism and dead tradition, and introducing into literature an element which was destined to transform it. In 1732 there appeared in Stockholm a weekly paper, edited anonymously, devoted to literary topics and to the discussion of the questions of the day. The publication of this little sheet was the immediate result of Dalin's English proclivities. His studies in English literature had formed his mind upon a new model, and the Svenska Argus (1732 to 1734) was the Swedish counterpart of the English Spectator, and a direct imitation of the example of Addison. The appearance of the Argus was a revelation. The public, accustomed to the monotonous dullness of its predecessors, was taken by storm by the wit, piquancy, and verve of the new periodical. Its first issue already relegated such publications as the Sedolärende Mercurius, itself only 2 years older, to the limbo of things outgrown. The paper at once attained universal popularity, and when the identity of the young editor became known, he was acclaimed as the foremost writer of the land, and was overwhelmed with favors from every side. His next work was Tankar om Kritiker, Thoughts about Criticisms, and the dramas Den Afundsjuk, The Jealous Man, a comedy in imitation of Holberg, and Brunhild, a tragedy. Returning from a tour, he created great enthusiasm by his Saga om Hosten, The Story of the Horse, 1739, a witty prose narrative in which, in the character of a horse, he related in a highly humorous manner the history of Sweden. This was followed by the satire, strongly suggestive of Swift, Aprilwerk om vår herliga tid, April Work of Our Glorious Time, a piece of writing which delighted the public. In 1742 appeared what was regarded by his contemporaries as the attainment of his highest poetic efforts, Svenska Friheten, Swedish Freedom, a didactic allegorical poem. Dalin was ennobled in 1751, and the youthful Queen of Sweden, Louise Ulrika, sister of Frederick the Great, appointed him to the double office of tutoring the young Crown Prince Gustav and writing a complete history of Sweden. These compulsory duties and the frequent festal poems, which in his capacity as court poet it devolved upon him to write, robbed him of the leisure to attempt any sustained effort, and from this time, aside from his history, the only products of his pen are occasional poems, of which a large number have been preserved. Dalin was the chief founder of the Vitterhets Akademi, Academy of Arts and Sciences, established by Queen Louise Ulrika in 1753, which in 1786, under Gustav III, was transformed into the Vitterhets History och Antiquitetsakademi. He was appointed Privy Councillor in 1753, and subsequently, being suspected of revolutionary intrigues, he was banished from the court. He returned in 1761. During the period of the exile, he worked upon his Sverikes Historia, History of the Kingdom of Sweden, which he ultimately brought down to the period of Charles IX. This appeared in 4 volumes, 1747 to 62. His collected works were published 1767. He died at Drottningholm, August 12, 1763. The immense influence of Dalin upon his age was disproportionate to the merits of his writings, and must be ascribed to his personality and to the new elements which he introduced, rather than to his creative genius. He was the force which opened new channels, the power which directed the new tendencies of his day. He broke away from the traditions of the German cult, which until his time had been the ruling power, and brought into Swedish the potent elements of French and English literature. Together with Madame Nordenflecht and other followers of his school, and aided by the French influence of the court, he completely transformed the character of the national literature. William H. Carpenter. Olof von Dalin, from the Swedish Argos, number 13, 1733. Cupius non ploquisse nimis. I hope you know me now, my reader, so that you will pardon me if I write but little, since that happens merely in order that I may set down the truth. I too am not my own master, for my offspring have now taken it upon themselves to shut off their speakers with that blow which makes for a creditable piece of writing, but afflicts the truth, in which respect I for the most resemble the fifth wheel of a wagon, and trouble myself no more about it than many a town councillor or juryman bothers his head about the verdicts which he signs and approves, without making it my business to prove it true, and as if asleep give in my vote. You must also yourself admit, my just reader, that it is necessary in our time to lie the truth in among the people. Our father Adam and mother Eve, it happened a short time since, came up out of their graves and were at their estate Tilkestad, where they presently proclaimed over the whole land a diet or assemblage, at which all their dear children of both sexes should appear in person, or by duly qualified substitute, in order that their universal parents might see and rejoice in their northern seed, might learn how apt was each and how he had improved his talent, and admonish him to do honor to his creation. Here was gathered together a considerable assembly of people. Each one, from the greatest to the least, went forward to kiss grandpapa's and grandmamma's hand. They bent and they bowed, and most of the inhabitants of the land now viewed with each other with all their might of soul and body, with internal and external senses, to see who should most please their first parents. For it may be believed it was no joke to be able to rejoice them with their excellence, now some 5,000 years after their death, and to put in their minds the thought, See, Adam, what a son you have! See, Eve, what a daughter, etc. Adam, who honored the first creation and loved nature's activity, which tolerates no compulsions or additions, was amazed when he saw his children, for he did not know half of them. Where have they come from? Said he. They are never mine, unless forsooth there shall have been a new creation, in the overseeing of which neither God nor I has had a part. Eve had indeed been proud of so many offspring, but was somewhat abashed at these words, and said, I should fear, sire, that you made me out an indifferent woman, if all did not know that we were alone in our conjugal state. Well enough is it web of my weft, he answered, but the children so disguise themselves in their attempts to please, that they lose all the charm which a spontaneous activity should otherwise most easily possess. Yet what am I saying? I readily see that our fall is the reason of this and of many disorders. It seems to me, said Eve, that you should have a review and teach the poor children how they should conduct themselves, so as not to continue in so monstrous a condition. Well, this was arranged, and all were now to pass before the eye of Adam, whether they had changed themselves or not. He had seated himself on a wall of earth, and all the liberal arts stood around about him. Dear children, said he to his offspring, come forward now, in order that I may see how you conduct yourselves. The inordinate desire of honor is the reason for this new creation, which does not however seek the honor of the great Creator but your own. When any of his children came forward, who without affectation lisped their tender thoughts, they were kissed with tears by the old man and matron, who said that nature in them was not restrained, and wished that they might henceforth continue in such freedom. "Behold, this," said they, "produces pleasure without you yourselves knowing it, and this is the kernel of the art of pleasing." Many court worshippers and people of the upper ranks of life, where ambition takes firmest hold of the body, also went forward, who for the most part had so well exercised themselves in appearances that they seemed neither in action nor word to be affected. These, too, won tolerably well in this way the commendation of the old people. Yet there were some of them who particularly thought to please kings and princes, who took upon themselves a more zealous appearance than they had inherited, and bore their bodies in greater state than birth had given them, beneath costly garments arrayed in precise order, so that they by this means spoiled all their beauty. For Adam had only aversion to such artificial figures. But what he did not have in them, he did have in a part of those who followed. Those were people of ordinary condition, who vied with the first, indeed with their own natures, in acquiring charm. When these latter had noticed that the people of rank had some fault or peculiar manner, then straightway seized by this wretched desire of honor, they wished at least to resemble the great in bagatelles. Some set one or two wrinkles on their foreheads, some a particular expression about the mouth, some lisped or stammered purposely, and introduced extraordinary sounds into their speech. Some affected strange laughter, some had a wonderful bend of the shoulders, some a simulated walk, some gave themselves political or statistical features, etc., etc., and all directly opposed to their otherwise natural manner. "Yes, I can tell you right straight out," said Adam, "I have not a little esteem for you, but listen, I will tell you a little story. It has been told me that my famous son, Alexander the Great, once upon a time twisted his neck out of joint, so that he was obliged to walk with his head somewhat awry. Straightway were all his lords and his courtiers moved to walk in the same manner, especially before his eyes, with the thought of pleasing him exceedingly. But among those who, whether out of zeal for their master or of love for themselves, would particularly be like the king, one twisted his neck so badly that his valiant prince, grown angry at such buffoonery, gave him so heavy a blow that the cuff set the heads right again for the whole court and army. If I were able now, I would certainly deal out many an affectionate blow to remedy all the evil habits with which you think to please me. I wish that Argus had today the same smart as a box on the air, for we saw this morning many affected cripples as sound and active as when they came into the world." "A part of you," continued Adam, "I notice compel yourselves to limp and stoop very seriously and with great discomfort on canes, as if 20-year-old legs were already afflicted with the rich man's sickness. But if someone took the canes and taught the young to spring, he would do rightly. Do you think it is no advantage to have good legs? If you think in this manner to imitate celebrated people, as has been said, then you shall know that it often offends him who is aped as much as it disfigures the ape himself. Many of our women who daily vie with each other for the possession of the greatest charm came forward, with the idea that the old people's hearts would be rejoiced with their comeliness. But that did not fall out well, since the one made a grimace by setting her mouth in a churchly manner, the other changed her features in that she wished to show her beautiful teeth. The third turned her eyes so strangely that they both blinked and squinted. The fourth had given herself a beautiful skin with ingredients from the apothecary's shop. The fifth assumed a fatigued gait. The sixth purposely appeared somewhat ill and languid. A pastor's wife forced her mild countenance into a scornful mien, A burgher's wife sweetened her mouth with ill-pronounced French words, and kept her body immovable because of her beautiful clothes. A merchant's daughter could think of nothing else than to bow. Another maiden twisted her face over both shoulders with a stiff glance, etc., etc., so that Eve said, "What is this? Will you please me with force? Ah, foolish women! If you wish truly to please, then you should not think of it. Such a thing must come to you unwittingly." When Eve said this, some men lamented the vanity and elegant frivolity of a part of a woman. But they were brought up sharply, for Adam said, "Will you now again transform nature, and make that into heaviness which is created for your pleasure and refreshing help? It befits you, it may be, better than that to be ill-favored. If any of you are born to seriousness, then it well becomes that one that she is too. But if you desire that others shall be like you and bother themselves with your thoughts, then is that ill conceived. For example, a woman may indeed amuse herself with books and little acts of cleverness, but if she makes study her trade, then she becomes a pedant." The malcontents, however, complained again that their mistresses desired that men should resemble them in all things except in sex, and hold them otherwise holy as women. But Adam replied, "If you are such fools, then shall you have advice. I see many gallants who readily undergo such a transformation, but that accords with their nature as does clay with straw, and surely an intelligent woman does not like it herself." Further Adam said, "Now I must laugh. Look at that bashful youth yonder in the crowd, who is so fearful of sinning against the customs of affectation that he does not know how he shall hold his hands. Now he sticks them here and now there. When he bows, he looks back with perplexity at all to see if he did rightly." At that moment there came forward some scholars and poets, who with references presented their works and verses, some of which they read. But Adam said, "Children, you were born to be shoemakers. You had understood awls better than pens. At the trade you had wrought out profit and pleasure, but not in study. Endowments are of many kinds, and everyone must consider which of them he has received." Thereupon some of the clergy came forward with soft steps, wholly assured that they would receive a caress from the old man for every time they had named him in their sermons. But when the pretended pious went along, he became straightway displeased. What should there avail the measured out words and the forced high-flown delivery filled with roses without fragrance? Suppose that he had seen some of them in the pulpit with their comedian affectations, or how unbecomingly they threw themselves and moved about there. Adam said shortly to them, "Such nonsense is unnecessary in your sacred office." In this consisted the whole caress. It is impossible for me to remember or to be able to describe all of those who at this time disgraced themselves before Father Adam and Mother Eve. This I know, that Japhet's grandsire pronounced this word of admonition. "My descendants," said he, "let it be fairly seen that you do not so badly disfigure yourselves as you have hitherto done. Let not the one take the other's talent and decry his own. Prove yourselves what character you own and abide with it. So shall you mark in each other that there is not one who is not made pleasing in his way, if it be rightly used. A surly man may be agreeable even in his surliness, and so on. Moreover, every one shall give himself to the service in the state to which he is fallen, and shall not, eager of honour, offer violence to nature, of which I see among you so many examples that I just now." Coughing deprived the old man of words, so that he stopped short, and straightway, as may be believed, the whole crowd made grimace upon grimace and laughed at him. The poor old couple were glad to get away from Tilkestad and lay themselves in their graves. So it went with the assemblage. Yes, believe me surely, He who will tell the truth appears at times like a hen on a perch in windy weather. Translation of William H. Carpenter. End of section 38. End of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 10,